He grew up among the dead, learning to read wounds, not words. Every scar told a story. Every body held the truth. Until one day, on the table was the only person he had left. And from that moment, he didn't need witnesses. He already knew who did it. So the boy who studied death decided to master it, climbing higher and higher until the world would have no choice but to call him a heavenly demon. This revenge wasn't a choice. It was the only path left. Hundreds of people had gathered at the Mirim Demonic Alliance, also known as the Demon Palace. One of the guards at the gate noticed how crowded it was. His partner agreed. They said they would accept anyone, regardless of faction or sect, and teach them demonic martial arts. The main thing was to have potential. What idiot would pass up such an opportunity? His partner said that if he were younger, he would have gone too. The man wanted to say something, but someone in the crowd caught his attention. He pointed to a boy in a white robe and asked if someone had died. His partner laughed and reminded him that the 10 Demon Palaces competition hadn't started yet. Was he imagining things again? He confusedly answered that he wasn't. What was this young embalmer doing here? This was the main character, Butlin, and he came here to avenge his grandfather. Butlin is the name his grandfather gave him after he found the boy abandoned in a snowy field. He learned the craft of embalming from him. They never had it easy. People hated them, but he didn't mind. One day, he showed him a body that was brought in for embalming, and Yinsul, having examined his muscles, said that he thought he was an expert in a very fast swordsmanship style. His grandfather asked him to explain why, and he enthusiastically replied that his body was thin, but the muscles in his legs were very strong, especially in the front of his shins. Most likely, this was due to the swordsmanship style he used. His grandfather patted him on the head and praised him. Heaven itself had bestowed upon him a talent for embalming. Looking at his smile, MC was very happy. No matter what trials he had to endure, his grandfather was always there. Until that day came. They went to bed as usual. It was a quiet, peaceful night. But then suddenly a gust of wind swept through the bamboo forest. This didn't escape the watchful old man's attention. He realized someone was there and said with annoyance that it was true what they say. Good people never look for him, and those who do are never kind. He shook the boy to wake him and offered him a game. He needed to try to play the dead man as best he could. Yinsul rubbed the sleep from his eyes and stood up, asking why the game was so late. His grandfather said that if he did well this time, he would buy him the clothes and sword he wanted so much. His eyes immediately sparkled with delight, after which he climbed into the coffin. His grandfather, closing the lid, smiled and asked him to try to hold out until dawn this time. His words made him suspect something was wrong, but it was too late to ask questions. He closed the coffin lid. Glancing at the front door, the old man took the sword with a serious expression and walked out of the house. The one who came for him said that he hid well, like a real rat. Wasn't he right? This unknown man hid his face under a veil. In fact, the old man was the 7 branches demon blade, Bu Janyang, and when the unknown man said this name, he said that he hadn't heard it in a long time. The unknown man drew his sword and pounced on him, exclaiming in rage, did he give up his position as deputy head of the palace just to make a living at such a miserable job? The blade almost reached its target. Janyang stopped it with his bare hands and replied that he took up the job of embalmer, not to make a living, but to repent. The unknown man smiled madly, and the old man said that he would give him his life, but not here. He didn't want innocent people to suffer. The man laughed, then turned towards the forest and said that he agreed, but he shouldn't even think about trying to escape. Janyang obediently followed him. Time passed. The MC pushed the lid off and climbed out of the coffin. He couldn't stand it any longer. He really wanted that uniform and sword, but it was too cold here. Seeing that no one was in the house, he looked around and wondered where he had gone. He was usually waiting for him when they played this. Had the performers really called him again? Because they were embalmers. These guys didn't even consider them human. He threw open the door with displeasure, and his eyes widened at what he saw. The ground in front of the house was cut up, as if someone had been fighting there. The night was quiet, but suddenly he heard a clanking sound coming from the bamboo forest and suspected something bad. Nervously swallowing, he ran toward the sound. After running for a while, he slowed down, caught his breath, stared at one point, and tears began to gather in his eyes. Up ahead, under a tree, sat his grandfather, without eyes and arms. He immediately called out to him and ran closer to him, panicking and asking who did this to him. Janyang asked, is it him, Yinsul? He confirmed it and asked through tears, what happened here? The old man didn't let him finish and said that he was sorry. He thinks his time has come. If he dies, he shouldn't give up the embalming business. He couldn't finish because he started coughing up blood, making the boy worry about him. He asked him to stop talking, but Janyang refused. He ordered him to listen to him carefully. He shouldn't even think about avenging him. MC was immediately overcome with rage and shouted that he would never forgive those who did this to him. He burst into tears even more and said that otherwise, it would be better for him to follow him. He always said that there was no difference between hell and this world. He would rather end up in hell with him than here without him. Realizing that he couldn't live without him at all, Janyang gritted his teeth and said that he thought he could easily let go of his death. This was his last request. Let him go far, far away from here. And he was very happy while he was near him. These were his last words. His body went limp and his head bowed. Yinsul couldn't hold him back and he fell, and he stared at him in shock and called out, but his grandfather no longer answered. After that, he pulled himself together and went about his usual business. With devastated eyes, the boy looked at the work table, on which lay no longer some stranger whose story he could tell from his body, but his grandfather. He touched his face and asked, Did he tell him not to avenge him, to protect him? But this time, he wouldn't listen. He shed another tear and moved on to analyzing the wounds on his body to figure out what had happened. His hands were clearly cut off in an instant. The slashing motion was performed from top to bottom, a rather rare move. Moreover, mid-attack, this man changed his technique to also take out his eyes. Such a strange sword technique definitely originates from the demonic path. Moreover, a person capable of inflicting such wounds must have studied the Tianju yoga technique. And his back, there are 93 marks from the use of a hidden weapon. Even the sky full of falling flowers technique can leave no more than 66. It doesn't seem like someone else is responsible for these wounds. Rather, they simply used a technique capable of inflicting at least 100 wounds at once. Also, the color of the underside of his tongue and nails suggests that a deadly poison that causes flesh and blood to rot was used on him. And now he had a portrait of the killer, a man from the demonic path, trained in the Tianju yoga technique, possessing a hidden weapon of the highest caliber, and using poisons that cause flesh and blood to rot. There are definitely not many such people in this world. He took one last look at his grandfather, and as he swore he would find that man no matter what, his eyes turned bloodshot. He now shed a tear on the document the guards had given him. He wrote his name and the clan he belonged to, the Zhanyang clan. Seeing what he had written, the man wondered, what kind of clan is this? It seemed the boy had come here and was frightened when he saw the life and limb liability waiver papers. He called out to him angrily and told him to get out of here if he wasn't going to put his fingerprint. But seeing the grim, determined expression on his face as he bit his finger until it bled, he fell silent and was surprised. MC put his fingerprint on the paper and thought that when his grandfather died, his life had fallen apart, and he had no choice but to embark on the path of revenge. And this competition would be the beginning of it. The battle between the two forces controlling the Murim, between the orthodox and unorthodox sects, raged for years. The orthodox sects, thirsting for justice, were led by the Murim alliance. The unorthodox sects centered around the demonic palace, which worshipped exclusively power. For a long time, a balance was maintained between them, but the orthodox sects desired greater achievement. This led to the creation of 18 martial arts masters, known as Masters for the Greater Good. With the emergence of a new threat from the Murim alliance, the demonic palace also decided to refine its powers. This is how the demonic masters were elected. Regardless of their previous employment, the palace selected 10 geniuses and trained them in the martial arts of the 10 demonic sects. It was this proposal put forward by the demonic palace that caused many youths to gather in one place, including Unseol. Inside, he saw a wide variety of young warriors, but he felt an imposing aura from only a few, and among them, there was surely someone related to his grandfather's killer. This killer possessed a level of skill he could not even imagine. To take revenge on such a person, he himself must become a martial artist. But now, with absolutely nothing, becoming one of the 10 demonic masters was his only chance to quickly increase his strength. Admiring sighs were heard from the youths as a rather large man walked out to them, accompanied by his subordinates. He shouted loudly and energetically that his name was Onhyo Creon, the chief instructor. Everyone called him the Golden Dagger with bloodshot eyes, and upon seeing him in person, the children were delighted. He said that 10 geniuses from various demonic sects would be selected in this place. Only those who pass all the tests they had prepared will be able to become candidates for one of the 10 demonic masters. His loud voice put pressure on the boys. One MC stood calmly. The instructor waved his hand, and the men behind him stepped forward. He said that the martial arts masters of the demonic palace would examine their physical abilities. The boys immediately began to protest. Was this a test? What about the competition? The masters began to roughly grope them, then tell them where to go. Yunsol thought that if they were satisfied with his condition, he would move on. Do they pay attention to physical ability? It was his turn. A man named Jingok approached him, placed his hand on his shoulder, and squeezed, after which his face immediately turned surprised. This boy is simply in a terrible state. Honestly, he's already shocked that he even participated. However, that look, that intent to kill, was impossible not to feel. He coughed awkwardly into his fist and walked away from him, thinking that despite this fact, he still couldn't let him pass. MC watched him go and thought that this was expected. All he had learned so far was to care for the dead. He would never pass a test like this. He felt his shoulders and thought that this was definitely not the end. As soon as the testing was finished, the head instructor announced the end of the first test, and Unchong shouted that this was unfair. If physical ability was important to demonic masters, why hold competitions at all? It was unfair. The man smiled and asked, "Is it unfair? When it comes to learning martial arts, bones are the most important detail." This test was aimed at weeding out those who would not be able to learn their arts, and he dared to complain without passing even the most basic test. The boy said that they should at least get a chance, and then the instructor's eyes lit up with gold, and he brought down a strong pressure on him, forcing him to fall to his knees, and told him not to worry. In the second test, he would choose those who could train even without a worthy body. After announcing the start of the second test, he walked towards the palace and turned to them one last time, saying that from now on, they must fight each other and survive. The test will end when the last one remains. The young men became nervous, and one of them asked, "Do they really have to kill each other? But they are all on the same side." Unchong took his weapon and sighed in irritation, looked around at everyone present and thought that this was only for the best for him. He glanced at the two boys, Unseol and someone else, and thought that if he had to kill someone, he would start with him. Immediately after that, he jumped up with a smile and threw a spear at him. Seeing this, MC was momentarily scared, but fortunately it was not flying at him. The spear pierced its target completely. Eunchong smiled and said that it had finally happened. Today, he would be able to kill him. The guy he hit, Hyokrion, grabbed the spear and hissed his name through clenched teeth before falling unconscious. His blood splashed on Unseol's face, and immediately afterward, the other test participants exclaimed in fear that he had actually killed him. The MC meanwhile carefully examined his body. He aimed between the ribs and hit precisely at the heart. He may have a weak body, but his agility and reflexes were impressive. Eunchong roughly pulled the spear from his body and said that anyone who wanted to end up like this idiot should attack. He would kill them all. Hyokrion noted that this was a good initiative, but useless. Overall, he expected the place to be full of trash. Jingak agreed with him and thought that in a situation like this, showing off your danger was like painting a target on your own back, but it would still get the others moving. The boys were nervous, unsure what to do, afraid that if this continued, they would die. So one of them took action, turning to the boy next to him and striking him with his sword. When his lifeless body fell, he took a step back in shock and dropped the sword, quietly saying that he didn't mean to. Eunchong took advantage of this and struck him. The instructor, watching the carnage unfold, thought that the less accustomed these kids were to death, the easier it would be for the fear of death to paralyze their minds. Then, he noticed something interesting and chuckled. Noticing what had caught his interest, Jingak also smiled. Now Eungang and Eunseol were standing by the wall, and the instructor noted that there were some interesting specimens among them. They both simply waited for most of the participants to die. Watching the fight, MC thought they were all fools. Fearing death, they completely turned off their heads. The golden dagger with bloody eyes said that the test will end when only one survives. So the point is not about killing, but about surviving. He decided to get busy and examine the wounds on the bodies, and thought that if he calmed down and did not lose his sanity, he could cope. He would definitely survive. Meanwhile, the fight continued. The guy wielding chains killed another guy, and seeing Eunseol thought, what happened to that guy? He looks pathetic. Had he been hiding all this time? MC at this time thought that these were thin but clear wounds from a sword. This guy died from a quick dagger technique. The guy decided to attack him. He threw his chain with a heavy end at him. Eunseol was able to dodge, but this thing pierced the box that he had been carrying on his back all this time. Clothes fell out of the drawer, and the guy laughed at him, asking what kind of box was that? Was he some kind of funeral supplies dealer? The MC remained silent, his face gloomy. The day his grandfather died, he found something. His grandfather prepared him a birthday present. The very clothes and sword he wanted so badly. He looked at the guy with a bloodthirsty glare. How dare he ruin his grandfather's gift? Seeing him getting up, he smirked and swung the chain, telling him to try it. But what can he do with that flimsy sword? Suddenly, Eungang appeared behind him. He delivered a sweeping blow to him, and he immediately fell. After that, he smiled at Eunseol and told him not to thank him. Actually, it's to his advantage when useless people like that distract the opponents. He ignored him and began carefully folding his clothes, and he said that he did have a keen eye, but he clearly had never studied martial arts. A guy attacked him from behind, but he immediately finished him off and said with a smile that he could kill him at any moment. MC only glanced at him. Meanwhile, Hyokrion noticed that the guy was holding Seokjong. Who is he? If he inherited the legacy of Mukyun, once the greatest of the Nakin, Jingak said that his name is Nyung Ungang. They say he found secret instructions and a sword left by Mukyun deep in the mountains. Since he is self-taught, his techniques are still weak and full of gaps. But now he can be considered Mukyun's only disciple. Although his base is weak, he is a good candidate for a place among the 10 demonic masters. He believes that now he can win. The head instructor stroked his beard thoughtfully and said it was still such a shame to hand Seokjong over to a newbie like him. But at least here, he seemed the strongest. Jingak agreed and added that this was true if no one was hiding any big surprises. Eunseol, meanwhile, continued examining the wounds and studying the techniques of his upcoming opponent. Soon everyone in the area was finished. Eungang wiped the blood on his clothes and said that, as he thought, he was the last one left. If he killed him, he would become a candidate for one of the 10 demonic masters. He beckoned him with his finger and told him to attack. But MC was in no hurry. He thought this guy was the strongest of everyone here, but he had already figured out his weakness while examining the bodies. He took the sword and confidently walked towards him, and he said that they would finally see what he was capable of. He rushed into the attack without thinking, landing multiple blows that Eunseol tried to dodge, but he wasn't always successful. He chuckled and exclaimed that all he could do was clumsily dodge. It was a miracle he'd lasted this long. Jingak thought that at first glance it might seem like he was panicking and couldn't control himself, but if you look closely, you'll see that at the end of each enemy strike, he moves slightly, avoiding fatal wounds. Could it be that he memorized the enemy's attack pattern from examining the corpses of other people he'd killed? What amazing powers of observation he had. MC caught his breath and said that his sword was so pathetic. After all those attacks, he couldn't cut off anything more than scraps of flesh. The guy was indignant, and Jingak nervously clenched his fist, wondering if he was provoking him. He was really good at dodging attacks, but a successful counterattack was a completely different matter. In this state, it would be difficult for him to attack properly. Ungang smiled maliciously and said that he had planned to let him live a little longer, but this arrogance was driving him crazy. Did he want to die quickly? He pounced on him in a rage, shouting that in that case he would help him, and Yoon Seol prepared himself. He focused and thought that he only had one chance. Examining the corpses Ungang left behind, he realized something. His killer attacks always target vital points, particularly the heart and head. That's why, if he was determined to kill, he would aim for the enemy's upper body. And so now, when he attacked, he crouched and dodged, which the guy didn't expect, and then aimed the blade at his neck. His grandfather once told him that the blood flow to the solar plexus is very difficult to control, even for the most skilled masters. Therefore, even if a child struck that point with all his might, it could easily render an adult unconscious. While the enemy was confused, MC quickly struck. Blood flowed from his neck like a stream, and then Unsol pulled out his sword and the body fell with a thud. He stood frozen for a moment, trying to catch his breath, then turned to the head instructor and asked, "Is the competition over?" They were both shocked by what they saw. Jingak remarking that it was a surprise, and Hyeokrion said with annoyance that he had high hopes for Mukyun's fencing. He struck the gong and announced that Bu Unseol of the Jajian clan had passed the second test, and so Unseol's journey of revenge began. His grandfather stood in the empty space, calling out for him, looking for him, and he joyfully ran to him and called out to him, saying that he was here. His grandfather, confused, said that he didn't see him. MC ran up to him and, catching his breath, asked with a smile, "What did he say?" At that very second, his eyes widened in horror. His grandfather turned to him and repeated that he didn't see him. Seeing his empty eye sockets, Insul was so frightened that he immediately opened his eyes and let out a short cry. He stood up and saw everyone looking at him. Hearing the sound of water outside and feeling a slight shaking, he realized they were now on a ship. Was he unconscious then? Well, he still lost a lot of blood. The injuries were quite serious, but now he barely felt any pain. Did the Demon Palace deploy some famous healer? In any case, all these people are very well built, and some of their faces are even familiar. Are these the ones who passed the first test? Seeing his gaze, one guy smirked, and the others turned away. He sighed and thought about their disdainful looks. However, this was an entirely expected reaction. The hatch opened, and the instructor's voice came from the deck, telling them to get out. They had arrived at the site of the next test, the Hellish Path. The ship docked at the rocky shore. The instructor descended and welcomed them all to Hell, telling them to follow him. He led the children deeper into the island, to a whole cave system, and said that they would be living here. They were to hand over all their clothes and weapons, change into what they were given, and take the prepared swords with them. Then the choice was theirs. They were to choose any cave and enter it. They scattered around the area. MC quickly looked around and walked along the caves. The children leisurely examined everything, while the others had already begun to argue. A girl said discontentedly that she had noticed this cave first, to which the guy replied that this couldn't be true. He had arrived here first. The guy approached them and told them not to quarrel. There were plenty of good caves here. Yoon Seol thought that all these people had no idea what had happened in the second test. They had completely lost their sense of urgency. Many of those who had passed the first test were dressed quite luxuriously. Are they all heirs to noble families? It seems the first gathering point was created solely to weed out those who are likely to die the fastest. He was distracted from his thoughts by the instructor's voice, which suddenly appeared behind him. He still hasn't decided? He shuddered and turned around and Jingex that he was being very slow. Now is not the time to wander around. He thought that he assumed this, seeing his gaze, but he didn't expect him to survive the second trial. He is curious what choice he will make now. He told him to choose a cave quickly, since time is short, and MC pointed to the cave in front of him, saying that then he will go to this one. The entrance was narrow, and there was some kind of puddle on the ground. Because of this, the others began to mock him, but the instructor was satisfied. He smiled and thought that he was a real genius. At first glance, this cave seems small and dirty, but that is only the entrance. Inside, there is so much space that you can safely practice martial arts, and the narrow entrance also diffuses the possibility of an ambush. Most people avoided this cave, but he had calculated everything. He left, telling him to get ready. Once everyone had changed, Jingak gathered them all together and showed them the map, saying that he would now explain what they should do next. There are 10 martial halls along the Hellish Path. In each of them, they can learn one of the martial arts of the demonic sects. Whether to learn them all or just one is up to them. There is no schedule either. Let them sleep, play with each other, practice techniques, or train alone, do whatever they want. Everyone was very happy. Only Unseol suspected something was wrong. This is all strange. The first 2 trials were turned into real hell. They won't let them just train peacefully. The children began discussing where to go. Most chose the Huawu Hall, rumored to be the strongest sect. They immediately went there, and MC mentally noted that most of them went to the same place. The Huawu Hall, the head of this sect, is rumored to be the strongest of the 10 demonic masters. Learning the best martial art would definitely be useful, but he hadn't learned anything yet, so for now he should focus on unadvanced techniques. He selected a location on the map and headed deep into the forest, There he found a flimsy house and wondered, is this really a martial hall? The Nanya Pavilion is a fallen sect, barely recognized by other masters, but it maintains its position only by producing many great warriors. His grandfather once told him about the world of martial arts. He decided to train here, and suddenly, the ground beneath his feet began to shift. He turned to check, and at that moment, a man's head emerged from the ground in front of him. He asked, "What is this?" He asked, "Has he come here to become one of the 10 demonic masters?" It was the master of the Nanya Pavilion's secret hall, Sao. Unseol was quite surprised by the master's unusual appearance, but he quickly composed himself and folded his hands in a respectful gesture, saying he had come to learn the martial arts of the Nanya Pavilion. The man carefully looked him over from head to toe, assessing him, and then told him to go back before he died. He had no intention of teaching anyone martial arts, especially someone as frail as him. MC said he had heard that mastering the Nanya Pavilion's martial arts could grant one the most powerful life force in the world. Sal began to retreat underground and remarked that he was well versed in their martial arts. But even true geniuses struggle to master the true techniques of this hall. Their techniques originate in the restructuring of the body. In his current state, he will die within a day. If he understands this, then let him go. Inseol bowed to him. This made him stop and ask, "What is he doing?" He replied that since he would be teaching him personally, as a disciple he should bow. Realizing that he wouldn't leave him alone, Sao called him crazy and sighed heavily. He emerged from underground and said that he would teach him, but he was only doing this because the Demon Palace ordered it. He told him his name and ordered him to call him Master Sao from now on. When Yunseol was about to tell him his name, he stopped him and said that he was simply the #1 disciple here. His fingers were covered in energy, and he said that they would not chatter but would get straight to the point. As soon as Sao touched him, his eyes went blurry, and he realized he could not see anything. This made him panic, but the master's voice quickly calmed him, telling him not to worry. He only temporarily sealed his vision with one of their pavilion's secret techniques. The basic unarmed martial art of Bongak is a mandatory procedure for understanding the path of the beast. This martial art not only heightens all senses, but also elevates reflexes to the level of a beast. Unlike other advanced martial arts, the pinnacle of their sex techniques depends heavily on the practitioner's personal ability and enlightenment. That's why even the foundation, the path of the beast, is studied with the same difficulty as any other advanced technique. It's because of this that the number of those willing to take on this ordeal has dwindled significantly over time. However, if he can master it, he will literally gain the abilities of a wild animal. But most people simply don't survive to that stage. He approached him and said that it would take him about an hour to get used to being blind, and then he would return. After that, Master Sao left, and he was left alone with his senses. People say that after losing their sight, all other senses become heightened, but so far nothing like that has happened to him. He said it takes about an hour to adapt, but that's too long. He should get used to it as soon as possible. He began wandering around, trying to rely on his other senses, and thought that in this place, countless martial artists were fighting each other for the position of Demon Master. If they ambushed him while he couldn't see, it would be bad. These thoughts made him imagine an enemy behind him. He immediately turned around and jumped to the side, dodging the blow, but landed rather awkwardly. Now he realized that having lost his sight, he should first and foremost pay attention to his sense of balance. Night fell. Master Sao finally got enough sleep and left the house, thinking that he must be wandering around somewhere lost. But contrary to his expectations, he was now hopping nimbly in front of the pavilion. Observing him, he noticed that this was unusual. Most people who have lost their sight simply wait for their other senses to sharpen. But this boy was actively moving, and it seemed he even imagined his opponents, trying to fight them. MC dodged another blow from an imaginary opponent, and deftly jumping over a rock, landed. Master Sao thought that it was precisely his active movements that allowed him to adapt faster. Pleased with the result, he grinned and said that, as he saw, he was already used to it. In that case, now let him try dodging his sword. And so 3 days passed. Inseol failed to dodge his blow and fell right into a puddle. As soon as he began to rise, Master Sao pounced on him and struck him in the side with the hilt of his sword, causing him to fall again. Sao thought that 3 whole days had already passed. He clearly should have questions about the training method, but he simply continued to take the blows silently. He asked why he didn't ask anything. Wasn't he curious about the correct way to dodge, or what techniques he used? He stood up and responded by telling him that he had said that the essence of the Nanya Pavilion teachings lay in the practitioner's personal abilities and enlightenment, so he decided that all his actions must have a good reason. The man chuckled and said he was right. After that, he rushed to attack, urging him to continue. At that very moment, MC felt as if lightning struck him. He sensed every movement of the master and saw the trajectory of his sword. But despite this, he would no longer be able to dodge it. But then all he could do was block it. A loud clang of steel rang out, their swords clashed, and Yunseol looked straight into the surprised master's eyes. He thought, did he just block the silent sword technique? And such a result in just 3 days? But the blow was strong. MC was thrown back and fell. After that, he thought, is it really so difficult to even block it normally? The instructor threw him a bottle and told him to drink. He felt the bottle and thanked him, then took a few sips and realized it wasn't water. His body suddenly felt energized, and it was as if even all the lost blood had been restored. What was this anyway? The man watched him closely. watching every sip. This was water from the divine spring, which he had treasured for as long as he could remember, but he didn't regret giving it to him, because he had finally met the one he had waited for his whole life. This was the most precious, uncut diamond in the martial arts world. A new day had dawned, and the blind training continued. Yoon-seol parried several of the master's blows, not missing a single one. Suddenly, Sao smirked and swung his sword, telling him to take another blow just like that. MC stepped back, dodging the blow, but that wasn't all. Suddenly, the master appeared behind him, and he immediately followed the trajectory of his sword and blocked the blow. It was over. He caught his breath and thought, why isn't he attacking anymore? Master Sao suddenly laughed loudly and said that he never thought he'd finally meet the genius he'd been waiting for his whole life. After that, Yoon-seol's eyes gleamed, his vision returned, and Master Sao delightedly placed his hands on his shoulders and told him to forget about becoming one of the 10 demonic masters and become an official disciple of their main sect. If he did this, he would turn him into one of the strongest demonic path masters in 10 years. MC lowered his gaze thoughtfully. Given everything he'd seen so far, he was probably telling the truth. However, the monster that killed his grandfather was undoubtedly significantly stronger than he was now. In this situation, the martial arts of the Nanya Pavilion wouldn't be enough. He had already made his choice and looked up at the master with a confident gaze, answering that he would become one of the 10 demonic masters. Sao was taken aback by his answer, then said that if he was going to learn all the martial arts of the 10 sects, he should forget it. Even a supreme grandmaster like the heavenly demon couldn't do it. Each martial art requires a special body and flow of energy. No matter how talented he is, he can only learn 2 or 3 styles at most. Focusing on learning one martial art is the shortest path to becoming the best on the demonic path. Yoon-seol respectfully apologized to him, again declining, and he realized he wouldn't change his mind. He let out a disappointed sigh and turned away, saying that from now on he would learn another martial art. He asked in surprise what that meant, but he had only just begun learning the basic techniques of the Nanya Pavilion. The master replied that the martial arts of the main sect are not transmitted through texts or oral traditions. After that, he turned sharply towards him and struck him with a blow, which he automatically blocked, and said with a smile that he had already learned the Beast Path technique. MC understood everything. All those attacks of his while he was blind were actually forms of the Beast Path technique. He bowed, thanking him, and he said that he didn't need to thank him. As he said, it was only an order from the Demon Palace. Yoon-seol noted that he had given him that water after all. He would never forget this noble gesture. Sao told him to forget about it. That's how the martial arts world works. Whether it's nobility or resentment, it's best to just forget them. He thought about his words, then bowed and said that it was time for him to leave then. Watching him disappear into the forest, the man smiled and wondered where this precious stone came from. Something great awaits the Demon Palace. As MC walked through the forest, he realized that everything now felt completely different. Because of mastering the Beast Path, he felt too much. He felt tired even without doing anything. At this rate, he wouldn't even be able to rest properly. He needed to learn to control it. He would try to suppress his feelings as much as possible during normal times, like blocking flowing water. He focused on his sensations, suppressing each one, and finally the noise around him died down. He opened his eyes and thought that this should be enough, then took out a map to figure out where to go next. The demonic palace would never allow everyone to train here forever. They might not have much time left, in which case he had no choice. The Grand Master of the peerless martial art who challenged the heavenly demons 700 years ago, the Huawu Sword Emperor, Zheng Huang. His only option was to go to the strongest of the 10 demonic sects, which he founded. After a while, he was already at the Huawu Martial Hall. He looked at the enormous doors before him and thought that compared to the hall of the Nanya Pavilion, this place seemed like a royal palace. He knocked, and a man immediately opened the door, asking, "A visitor at such a time?" It was Jingak, and upon seeing Yoon-seol, he was greatly surprised. He immediately recognized him and bowed to him, saying that he had come to learn the martial art of the Huawu sword sect. Jingak waved his hand and told him to follow, and as they walked, he explained that this sect's martial art was the strongest of all 10. So it required a very long time to master. Those who came here earlier had already completed the beginner's hall and moved on to the intermediate level. Is there a reason why he only came here half a month later? He answered that he had studied the martial arts of the Nanya Pavilion, and he asked, does that mean he had already mastered the Beast Path? He confirmed this, and he thought that he already knew that he was gifted, but not so much as to master the Beast Path in 2 weeks. Sao probably just sent him away so as not to waste time on training. Well, nothing can be done about it. He led him to the training hall and said that his name was Jingak. He was in charge of the beginner's hall. He could call him instructor. Is he sure he wants to learn Huawu sword techniques? Maybe he should go to another training hall? MC thanked him for his concern, but he would learn the techniques of the Huawu sword sect. Jingak didn't try to dissuade him and kicked the floor with all his might. A scroll fell from the ceiling and said that these were the basic forms and practical principles of the 13 Huawu forms. Let him study them and begin training. Yoon-seol stared at this scribble in confusion and asked what he should do with it. Jingak frowned in confusion and asked what he was talking about. Didn't he really know how to read diagrams? He replied that he couldn't read such things. He had never studied fencing before he came here. Jingak was surprised, to say the least. He asked, does he really understand anything? He was confirmed to be so, and he thought it was strange. He was listed as a student in the records, but even his movements during the second test didn't resemble any of the formal sword styles. Still, not being able to read sword diagrams is surprising, but if you look at it from another perspective, given his reflexes and attention to detail he demonstrated in the second trial, as well as his prudence in choosing a cave to live in, if he starts completely from scratch, then with proper training, he will definitely succeed. He smiled and pointed to the scroll, asking, even if he can't fully interpret the diagram, he will recognize the letters, right? Let him read it. It said, how to release the body and flow effortlessly. He explained to him that the first part, release the body, meant relaxing the muscles and moving smoothly while using sword techniques. In particular, you need to relax the abdominal muscles and thigh muscles. Yoon-seol tried to relax and slouched and asked, is that how it should be done? Jingak remained silent and thought it was strange to teach the basics in a place where candidates for the position of Demon Master were to be selected. He walked up to him and, pressing on his stomach and back, told him to straighten up. When he tenses up, he blocks his core. Let him calm his mind and relax. Now they will move on to the second part. Flow effortlessly. MC immediately extended one hand and moved the other back, and he noticed with surprise that he had assumed the correct posture. He understands everything so quickly, he smiled and praised him. His body position is simply flawless. After that, he continued to explain everything to him, and he repeated, and they were both very happy with the results. It was time to repeat these movements, but this time with a sword. He swung it, drawing a semicircle, then ran forward and, swinging, made a sharp lunge. Jingak smiled as he thought he was simply born for this. Now he told him to imagine an opponent in front of him and perform the 13 Hwawu forms. This is the condition for completing the beginner's hall. He will feel the purpose of the sword in his technique. Yoon-seol thought that this was another test. The chance came faster than he expected. He needs to prove himself. He assumed a fighting stance and thought of an imaginary enemy, the one he must defeat. A man, his opponent, appeared before him. He immediately drew his sword and swung it, using the first form of Hwawu, returning the wind to its source. The man was surprised, watching his movements. Meanwhile, he was using the third form, drifting cloud, misty curtain. Jingak wondered if these were really the 13 forms of Hwawu. The drifting cloud should be soft and swift. The sword should flow like a cloud and spread its power like fog. But the version this young man was showing was incredibly sharp. Could he be deliberately changing the forms? But usually, no one below the level of a grandmaster would dare to repeat such a thing. Moreover, this adapted form carries such a killing intent, as if aimed at the person he thirsts for revenge for a loved one. It's simply an incredible sight, the Hwawu technique, renowned for its righteousness even on the demonic path in such a sophisticated form. What secret is he hiding? At this moment, MC became nervous and noticed that something was wrong. The trajectory of his sword was changing due to the position of his fingertips. Could this really be the influence of the beast path? The higher he climbs the Hwawu forms, the clearer the imprint of this technique becomes. But no matter how much he wants to, he will not fully comprehend the forms. And even if he does, it will no longer be the 13 Hwawu forms, but a completely new style. He needs to strive to perform the original form. As soon as he tried this, his eyes turned bloodthirsty. His opponent became that unknown person, the killer of his grandfather. At the sight of him, emotion immediately overwhelmed him. He gritted his teeth in rage and lashed out, using the 7th form, overturn the seas, cross the 4 oceans. But the stranger dodged his blow with a mocking smile, and he thought he was so fast. He struck so quickly and dodged them just as quickly. He had never met anyone faster. At that moment, the assassin drew his sword, made a sharp forward attack, and Yoon-seol leaned back, thinking that he was not giving him a second to breathe. He changed his grip and pounced on him, deciding to use all his remaining forms right now. After that, he struck many times, but the smile on the face of his grandfather's killer did not waver at all, and he swung the sword. Cold steel touched his hands, and then the sensation was replaced by a burning sensation. He suffered the same fate as his grandfather. The imaginary opponent disappeared, but the sensations he experienced during the fight remained. He stared at one point in horror, trying to catch his breath, and involuntarily dropped the sword from his hands, causing a loud thud to resound in the ensuing silence. Jingak thought that he had ultimately lost, but it was still incredible. He smiled and approached him, saying that he had passed the test. In the beginner's hall, they evaluate his grip and whether he is able to apply the 13 Hwawu forms in combat. He stepped on the sword, deftly tossed it and caught it, and said that he demonstrated it simply perfectly. He handed him the sword and said that he had flawlessly executed the 13 Hwawu forms, so he was ready to move on to the intermediate hall. MC looked at him in surprise and thought that it must have been very difficult for him to teach a person with zero knowledge of the sword, and yet he took it on, walking him through each stage. He folded his hands in a respectful gesture and thanked him for everything, and he asked him to continue training so hard. His face suddenly became serious and he said that his sword carried a clear killing intent. He should be careful and not let this desire consume him. Yoon-seol thought about this, after which they said goodbye, and Jingak thought that now he understood. He really had mastered the path of the beast in just 2 weeks. It seemed that due to his unique learning speed, he also finished the beginner's hall earlier than expected. At first, he doubted whether he would even be able to reach the middle hall, but now he was confident that even the middle hall instructor would definitely notice his potential. Meanwhile, MC entered the middle hall, where classes were already in full swing. Instructor Chan Eungwan gave him a displeased look and said that he didn't know who he was, but they had no space, so he should leave. Judging by the looks of it, he had just finished the beginner's hall. If it took him more than 20 days to learn the 13 Huawu forms, then with such abilities, he's just wasting his time here. Seol bowed and told him that he was late, because he spent the first 2 weeks in the Nanya Pavilion Hall. Eungwan arrogantly asked, does he mean to say that he finished the beginner's hall so quickly? And he didn't believe him, thinking that he probably just couldn't master the way of the beast and fled from there. He said that since he did finish the beginner's hall, he should go to the center of the hall and sit down, although he wasn't sure if he could catch up. When the MC took his seat, the instructor explained to them that the Huawu sword sex techniques are a martial art consisting of quick movements. Therefore, if they aren't proficient with the sword, they can end up injuring themselves. Therefore, their sex techniques are difficult to use in real combat. And yet, it's only a basic swordsmanship style, nothing more than part of the process. So he won't look at victories or defeats, but at how well they wield a sword. He asked Bae Kansung, who was sitting next to Seol, to come forward and choose an opponent for a duel. He stood up and asked with a sly grin, can I choose anyone? The instructor confirmed this, and the boy pointed to Seol, saying that then he would choose him. Eunwan wanted to object, but the boy cut him off, noting that he himself had said he could choose anyone. The instructor irritably called him an idiot, and asked what kind of fight he was planning to show him with someone who had just arrived at the beginner's hall. Let him choose someone else. MC said he didn't mind. The instructor didn't hear him, and he stood up, declaring that he accepted the challenge. Instructor Jingak had taught him swordsmanship in the beginner's hall, so he thought he could learn faster here too, crossing swords with someone else. The instructor remained silent, and wondered if he was trying to defend his pride with the skills of a single beginner's hall. He decided not to object and sighed heavily, then pointed to the weapons rack and said that being able to measure one's own skills was worthy of a martial arts master, and he hoped his skills would justify his presence in the intermediate hall. MC took the sword, and Hansen grinned, thinking that this was such luck. There were so many cute guys around that it was hard for him to stand out, but if he dealt with this brat properly, he would strengthen his position. They stood opposite each other, and he said that he had no shortage of courage, but with only fighting spirit and pride, he would not survive in the world of Murim. As soon as the instructor announced the start of the fight, the guy with a sovereign smile on his face walked towards Seol and swung his sword, and he ducked, dodging his blow. He exclaimed that it impressed him, and then delivered a flying strike, which Seol immediately blocked. Noticing how his hand was shaking, Hanseong's confidence in victory increased, and he thought that he felt this awkwardness in his fingertips. He really was a complete beginner. He laughed, calling him a clumsy idiot, and said that he would show him how Huawu techniques work. He swung his sword, used his first form, and laughed loudly again, but this time, MC showed him something that made him nervous. He easily dodged all of his strikes, which made him take the fight more seriously. Eungwan thought Hanseong's swordsmanship was pathetic, but then again, that boy wasn't dodging thanks to speed. Those movements were almost predictable. Could he really have mastered the way of the beast? Although it's said to be the basic martial art of the Nanya Pavilion, in reality, it's the hardest martial art, mastered only by great masters. No matter how gifted he is, it's impossible to master all of this in 2 weeks. He loudly stamped his foot, drawing their attention, and told Seol that if he only dodged, he wouldn't be able to appreciate him. He seemed to have already said that this duel was aimed at testing their swordsmanship, not their instincts and reflexes. The MC immediately stopped and focused, then delivered the first blow, which greatly surprised the other students, who saw Huawu techniques in his movements. Hansung dodged his blow and grinned, asking, so he can use forms too? One of the students noticed the difference, and surprised, thought it was something completely different. At that moment, Hansung began to mock Seol's techniques, saying that he could demonstrate them with his eyes closed. But at that very moment, his sword flashed right next to his face, cutting off a clump of his hair, and he was startled. He wondered what that was. Are these exactly the same techniques they were learning? Had this idiot deliberately hidden his skills to make fun of him? Does he want to get the instructor's attention and advance to the next room? He felt a ton of eyes on him, and thought that at this rate, he wouldn't be allowed in. He gritted his teeth in rage and shouted that he would be moving to the advanced hall, then used the Asura sword technique, the blood-stopping strike. Eungwan thought it was a killer move from the Asura sect. Well, he didn't say to use only Huawu techniques, but this guy didn't lose his balance even in this situation. He increasingly doubted that he was incapable of learning the beast path. At that moment, Hansong noted that he was very good at dodging, but now he was definitely finished. Noticing his stance, the instructor became worried, and he pounced on Unsol with the blood wind technique, destroying the moon. MC quickly changed his grip and delivered a strike that shocked everyone in the hall. It was the 13th form of Huawu, an extreme martial art without a beginning. With this swift movement, he struck his opponent straight in the chest. Blood started flowing from his mouth. and then he fell unconscious to the floor with a loud thud. The MC glanced at him, and everyone else's mouths dropped open in surprise, wondering if he was dead. Yoon-seol put the sword back, and the instructor walked up to the student and realized that he was dead. The blow had hit a vital point. He asked Yoon-seol if he was a former student of the Nanya Pavilion. He told him that he wasn't, and he asked if he really meant to say that he learned the way of the beast in half a month. He told him that he was only taught the basics, and he chuckled, saying that it seemed like the Nanya Pavilion primarily taught its students to lie. Yoon-seol wanted to explain himself, but the instructor told him to stop making excuses and get it out of there immediately. Meanwhile, the other students were shocked. How could he kill a man right during a routine sparring match? Shouldn't he be punished? Eun-gwang gave them a stern look and told them not to confuse this place with a real martial arts hall just because of its name. They mustn't forget that they were in hell, and if they used a killing technique, they should be prepared to die from a counterattack. Now the test will continue. He began calling 2 students at a time to spar with each other and evaluate their swordsmanship. When he finished, he said that they had all failed the test, so they should leave this place and find another martial arts hall. One of the students excitedly said that this was only one test. If he gave them another chance, they would pass. The instructor sternly said that it was impossible. They could pass the beginner's hall thanks to good physical ability, but in the end, to master the Hwawu sword technique, a person needs the talent of a martial genius who will surpass the limits of his own body through incredible effort. They failed precisely because they were incapable of such a thing, and now let them go. They all left, only Yoon-seol remained in the hall. The instructor, confused, asked why he wasn't leaving, and he asked if he needed to too. He confirmed it. After all, he had won the duel and passed the test, so now he could ascend to the advanced hall. But Yoon-seol decided to stay here, causing the instructor to be confused and ask the reason. He replied that he had only learned the 13 Hwawu forms so far, and hadn't learned anything in the middle hall. Eun-gwang noted that he had learned the way of the beast and then repelled the chaotic style of the Asura sect. And he still says he hasn't learned anything? He confirmed this, and the instructor chuckled, saying that he agreed to teach him. He would teach him the Byokro sword technique, which follows the 13 Hwawu forms, but he despised those who used tricks just to impress. If he saw even the slightest hint that he had studied swordsmanship beyond the Hwawu techniques, he would immediately behead him. 4 days passed, and the instructor was shocked. Just now, watching Yoon-seol's movements, he thought that he had been training him for 4 days, and had studied him from every angle, but his swordsmanship foundation was practically zero. To think that he had really barely begun to learn swordsmanship, but his determination was simply incredible. He gave everything in every movement, as if he would die if he didn't learn. Now he understood how he had mastered the way of the beast in just half a month. At this time, Yoon-seol used the Byokro sword technique, Extreme Lightning Strike, but right in the middle of performing the technique, the instructor ordered him to stop. He immediately froze in place and looked at him in confusion, and the instructor said that he could stop. It seemed that he had already grasped the essence of the Byokro sword technique. He caught his breath, and the instructor approached him, saying that the Byokro sword technique is a style that requires sharp turns of the body to quickly switch between speed and chainsword forms. Moreover, all the forms are designed for such sword movements around the body that they are literally inapplicable in real combat, and yet he tries to use absolutely every form in battle as if he wants to kill someone. He asked, but isn't that the main purpose of a sword style? Eun-gwang said that demonic martial arts require the intent to kill. However, the Hwawu sect has abandoned this mindset, which exists only for killing opponents, in order to achieve greater heights. The intent to kill is in his head. If he doesn't erase it, he will create a sword style that will only bring him harm. Yoon-seol remained silent, thinking he was saying the same thing as instructor Jingak. Eun-gwang told him that in the past, and still does, he personally lived with a similar feeling, and without hesitation eliminated everyone who stood in his way. But because of this, his status, honor, and even martial arts proficiency have fallen to a lower level. The lust for murder may seem to lead you to great heights, but in reality, it's just an obstacle blocking an infinitely broad path. From now on, he must rid himself of this feeling. And then Yoon-seol remembered his grandfather's words. The past of all martial artists is tainted by regret and failure. That's why everyone in the martial arts world doesn't like to talk about their past. He asked the instructor in surprise why he told him this, and the instructor replied that he thought he'd already said that he'd experienced the consequences firsthand. What's his name? He told him his name, and Yoon-wang remarked that he now understood that when Jingak talked about the survivor of the second trial, he was talking about him. He has a serious problem, a complete lack of martial arts foundation. His opponents are promising young men who have trained in martial arts from a young age. Once he begins studying the more serious aspects of the Hwawu sword in an advanced hall, the gap in their skills will only widen. To get rid of this, he must quickly learn the highest martial art and build a foundation for learning Hwawu techniques. Therefore, to eliminate the difference, he will now pass on to him the Jonggro Musan technique, which he created himself. However, while learning it, he made a mistake, after which all the nerves in his fingers became dull. This technique is so dangerous that he could even completely lose control of his hands. Instead of advancing to the next hall, he could become an armless cripple. Is he willing to accept this risk? Yoon-seol agreed without hesitation. Just hands? For the sake of revenge, he is ready to tear out and give up his own soul. The protagonist thought it had been a month since he began learning the Zhongromuzan technique before leaving the intermediate hall. The instructor had said he'd mastered it quickly, but it still took longer than he'd expected. Having mastered the basic techniques in the beginner's hall and the more complex ones in the intermediate hall, he could finally advance further. With these thoughts in mind, he walked into the room. Everyone present turned their attention to him, including instructor Seojun. The protagonist glanced around and thought, the advanced hall definitely felt different. Even the air seemed different here, and he sensed a completely different energy from the other students than in the intermediate hall. The disdain had vanished from their gazes. Of course, after he'd killed that guy, caring for bodies disgusts people, but killing another person shows reverence and respect, right? At that moment, Seojun closed his eyes and, extending his hand forward, said, "It seems he is Yoonseol." He'd heard of it. He was lucky. He hadn't even started the lesson yet. He should sit down. Then he looked at the other students and added that since they had a new student, they should let him explain the Hwawu sword song and the 7 teachings again. Strength flows through the entire body. Stand up straight, maintain balance, chest wide back straight. Don't overdo it on the first strike. MC thought, I see. All these teachings, without learning the more complex techniques in the middle hall, they simply wouldn't understand it. After a while, Seojun said, this would be the end of today's lesson. Inseol, he should stay with him for a while. In response, the protagonist looked at him silently. After a while, they went out into the courtyard, and Seojun, reaching out to a tree branch, said, no sword shall defeat a sword. A sword means reaching a level where a person can defeat an armed opponent even without a blade. Simply put, with or without a sword, his strength should be unlimited. The next second, he tore off a tree branch and instantly aimed it at the protagonist. He asked him to imagine he was being attacked right now, but his hands were empty. How would he use his swordsmanship? The protagonist looked at him in surprise, and then the instructor added that during his time in the middle hall, the students here had already mastered the first Hwawu sword technique, dazzling yet profound, and now they had moved on to this line of reasoning. If he didn't understand and figure out what he was asking, he would immediately leave the hall. He should answer carefully. In response, the protagonist closed his eyes and said, if I don't have a sword in my hand, he said. He opened his eyes and, pointing his hand forward, added, I'll use the enemy's sword. He reached for the tree branch, but the next second, the instructor appeared from behind him. He said, a hasty decision. The MC turned around abruptly, wondering why the hell he was already behind him. He frowned and thrust his hand forward again. He thought it was impossible to even try to guess where he'd end up in the next instant. He didn't expect him to be able to keep up, but he didn't think he'd be able to follow his movements. If he doesn't show anything now, he won't be allowed to stay in the advanced hall. Push the beast's senses to the limit, read the direction of his movements. Just once. At that moment, his hand approached a tree branch, and then Seojun directed a powerful energy at him, sending him flying backwards. He fell to the ground, then rose, squeezing his eyes shut. The next second, the instructor placed a hand on his shoulder and, sitting down next to him, laughed loudly. He said he did it, and the protagonist thought he'd managed it, but he hadn't landed a single blow. Why was that? Then the instructor rose and said that starting tomorrow, he would begin learning a new technique. He must be at the training grounds before everyone else, before dawn. In response, the MC bowed and said he understood. After that, the instructor looked at the branch in his hands, and the leaves had fallen from it. He thought, it seems even a wolf cub still carries the danger of a full-grown wolf. Then he grinned and said he was looking forward to it. After some time, the protagonist walked through the forest and thought that classes were over for today. He could rest or cultivate energy, or perhaps explore the hellish path a little. Remembering the middle hall, you never know where a fight might suddenly break out. At that moment, he heard sounds behind him and thought, footsteps? He closed his eyes and thought he'd look. 1, 2, 3, no 4. He turned around, noticing several students, and thought 5. At that moment, one of them folded his arms across his chest and said, Unseol, he's been arrogant since the middle hall. It's time to break that habit. His comrade smiled and added, since he killed first, he shouldn't complain about injustice. The disciple said that the 5 of them were already known as the 5 strongest swordsmen before they came here, the best of the best, so he had to prepare. In response, the MC looked at them silently and thought, no, one more. He took a stance, and the disciples reached for their weapons. One of them shouted, idiot, he wants to test them. The next second, So Jinha appeared behind him and struck him with his weapon, causing the disciple to fall lifelessly to the ground. The others turned around in fear and said, Jinha, and he said, Unseol, we need to talk. The disciples wondered what he was doing here, and he told them to get lost. He wasn't interested in small fry. The others looked at him in irritation, and the next second they turned and ran in the opposite direction. They shouted, damn it, they'll come back to him. At that moment, the protagonist looked at Jinha and, frowning, thought, this guy is strong. Jinha then sheathed the sword and, with a sigh, said, yeah, cowards. He then turned his gaze to the protagonist and said he would ask directly, Unseol. He pointed his sword at him and asked, which side is he on? The instructor had said shortly before that, until now, they had all learned the first Hwawu sword technique, dazzling yet profound, but they could only claim to have fully mastered it when they created their own sword form. Now was the time to look at what they had all created. Unseol, he must perform the first technique. After a while, the MC climbed onto the platform, holding the weapon in his hand. He then sighed, closing his eyes, then frowned, looking forward resolutely, and swung his sword several times, advancing. Energy scattered scattered in all directions, and the blade of his sword left marks on the surface beneath. Seojin looked at him and thought, he's taken the most serious and complex sword technique and transformed it into something designed for killing. Then, he said he could return to his seat. Next, Jinha. The next second, he rose from his seat and walked past the protagonist. The protagonist focused his attention on him, and then Jinha climbed up and prepared to demonstrate. He thought at that moment, Jinha definitely counterattacked him instead of Hyun, as if warning him. In the present tense, he asked, what does he mean? He shouted at him to stop playing dumb. He knew that not everyone here had gathered to become one of the demonic masters. He thought, if you think about it, even though this was an incredible opportunity to learn the art in 10 sections, there was literally nothing required to participate. In that case, this opportunity also becomes a trap for unwanted people. The protagonist then put his hand to his lips and asked, does he mean to say there's a spy among the disciples? Jinha frowned, looking at him and thinking, judging by his expression and voice, he's not lying. He then sheathed his sword again and sighed, saying, so it wasn't him. He was just hoping for some fun. Then he turned around and added, well, he shouldn't raise his head in the training hall and should be a good boy. If he continues to get on his nerves, he'll get rid of him. With these words, he seemed to look at him and then walked forward. The protagonist watched him go and thought, a spy? It seems he still doesn't know much. He guesses it's because he's been putting all his effort into studying the arts of the Nanya Pavilion and the Hwawu sect. Then he raised his head and thought, well, there's no need to worry for now. Be it a spy or some kind of demon, they're just opponents he'll have to fight. He said, it's about to begin. After a while, Sojin put down his textbook and, sighing, said, training is over for today. He could imagine how exhausted many of them were by this day. However, even masters who have experienced countless real-life battles always take the time to study the principles of advanced martial arts. Because in this matter, knowledge doesn't equal ability. Ability to do something can't be equated with knowledge. His interpretation of the principles which he had imparted to them so far would prove a great asset to each of them on their journey through the world of martial arts. Therefore, he wished them success in all their upcoming fights. At this moment, the students were surprised. The sound of a gong? What was happening? Then the instructor extended his hand and said, the time has come. They must immediately head to the mountain in the center of the island. After some time on the mountain, Jingak stood on a hill and looking at Hyokreon said, everyone gather. He said thoughtfully, from now on, the third test will begin. The disciples began to mutter among themselves in surprise. A third test? Not the second? Meanwhile, MC thought the life or death fight he'd gone through was the second test. He didn't know about the others, but the next second, Jingak said, soon all the caves will be sealed. Until 10 candidates are chosen, they won't be able to return to this one. Therefore, they must prepare everything they need in advance. Then one of the disciples raised his hand and asked, by what principle will the candidates be chosen? Jingak said, this, and Hyokreon said, a pathetic disgrace of the demonic path, idiots. He pointed to the side and told them to kill each other. They kept killing until there were only 10 remaining. Did that make sense? The others looked at him in confusion, and then he smiled and added that they should hide in the shadows or avoid combat. The choice was theirs, but it wouldn't help them. Over time, the restricted area would shrink, and those who remained in the forbidden zone would be killed by these ghosts. At that moment, the protagonist frowned and thought, their murderous aura reaches even here, true masters with incredible skills. Then one of the students asked if they weren't allowed to attack the ghosts. Yeokreon laughed loudly and shouted that if he wanted to be among the top 10, he had to deal with something like this. Of course, they could engage them in combat, even kill them if they had the strength. If they killed one of the ghosts, they would immediately take a place among the 10 selected candidates. The protagonist thought, this means that killing one single ghost is more difficult than killing a bunch of people here. Then Hyokreon added, they must remember, they can group up and set up ambushes. They don't care. As long as they can kill, they must use any means necessary. He clenched his fist and shouted, this is the only way they can become one of the chosen ones. After a while, everyone ran forward. MC rushed forward and thought that he needed to move quickly. He had already attracted too much attention from the other students. If he didn't get out of here, he might fall into a trap, just like that time. First, he would go to a safe place, and for him, this was definitely it. After a while, he ran up to a building and, stopping abruptly, thought, the ground feels different. He put his hand on the ground and thought, this. He quickly looked to the side and thought that someone was coming. He sensed 3 figures and then noticed Gom Chul-young, who extended his hand from the bushes and asked him to save him. These idiots have attached themselves to him and are trying to kill him. At that moment, the protagonist drew his sword from its sheath. Chul-young, emerging from the bushes, shouted that if he helped, he would be in his debt, and the protagonist thought, a trap? No, the wounds were real. Only 3 pursuers, and they had teamed up. He didn't want to get involved in this, but it would be problematic if they learned his location because of him. Then he looked at his pitiful face, and the next second lifted his cloak, revealing a hole in the ground. After a while, the students emerged from behind the bushes and, looking around, asked where he had gone. He definitely couldn't have escaped so quickly. At that moment, MC and Chul-young were sitting underground, and then one of the students said, what a jerk. He'll personally finish him off no matter what. Then the student pointed forward and said, he's definitely somewhere nearby. They have to go. The next second, they ran forward, and after a while, the protagonist lifted his cloak and emerged from underground. Chul-young followed him and coughed loudly. After that, they stood up, and Chul-young, smiling, looked at him and thanked him for saving him. Then he looked at the pit and added, if not for him, he definitely would have. At that moment, MC thought this pit wasn't just made to hide. As he thought, Master Sao had prepared it for him. While inside, he felt his senses of the beast path sharpen. The sound of feet stepping on the ground, the sound of swordplay, the sound of every vibration. The situation became so clear to him, as if he were seeing everything with his own eyes. The beast path uses vibrations. He believed he wanted to teach him this. And yet, he looked at Chulyong, and he folded his hands in front of himself and said, that's right, he's Chulyong, from the blood sect. Can he know his name too? But the protagonist silently walked forward, and he waved his hand and said, then they'll go together. When the third trial began, he immediately went into the forest. But everyone kept attacking and chasing him. It was scary. He put his hand to his chest and asked if he didn't mind. Could he come with him? He even hid him, so he felt he could trust him. But the protagonist silently walked on, and Chulyong, smiling, followed him and said that he would consider this consent. After a while, MC put his hand to the ground and said that they would have to go around. Someone was fighting nearby. Chulyong looked at him and, smiling, asked, can you feel the vibrations? How cool. Will he teach him? But the protagonist silently walked forward and heard a voice. They will watch. Even if he has to give up his soul, he will avenge his brothers. At that moment, he thought, revenge, a familiar feeling of hatred. Chulyong looked at him and wondered what had happened to him suddenly. The protagonist walked on and said that the plan had changed. He would join the fight. Chulyong clenched his fist and shouted in surprise, what? After a while, they hid behind a bush until one of the students jumped down from a tree branch. He held his sword out in front of him, but the protagonist held his weapon out, blocking his attack. He was indignant. How had he blocked his killer technique? The forbidden extreme invisibility art? Was he really an assassin too? The next second, the MC rushed forward and swung his weapon, cutting the student down. Then he fell lifelessly to the ground. He thought, an assassin's skill concealing their presence. If not for the beast's path, he would have had trouble dealing with it. And at that moment, Chulyong screamed in fear. Blood. The protagonist concentrated and thought, they're still fighting. If he helped him deal with the assassins, would he be able to feel the satisfaction of revenge? At that moment, he noticed the student kneeling on one knee, surrounded by several more students. They were saying, this is the end. They must finish him off quickly. As a sign of respect, he would kill him quickly. Then one of the students turned around in surprise, and at that moment, the MC jumped at them, attacking with his weapon, but the guy held his sword in front of him, blocking his attack. And then he shouted in surprise, who the hell is this? Was he not alone? Then someone jumped on the protagonist from behind, and the student shouted, I just need to kill one more. But the next second, the protagonist suddenly leaned over, causing the student to attack his comrade, and he shouted, idiot. They all rushed to attack the protagonist, and he swung his sword, parrying their attacks. Then another guy ran at him and shouted that he must die. But the next second, drops of his blood splashed on the protagonist's face, and several more attacks were added by the student this group had attacked. He laughed loudly, striking again, and then he said, his revenge, he has completed it. With these words, he fell lifelessly to the ground, and the next second, Chulyong peeked out from behind the bushes and asked, well, are we done? At that moment, the protagonist crouched next to the body of one of the students, and Chulyong came closer and said, Sol, his skills are simply incredible, but he pulled out a dagger and swinging it, added, even with this, you can't relax. He then struck, but the protagonist with a sharp wave of his hand, parried his attack with his sword, and he was surprised. How? The MC spun around sharply, throwing him back and said, it's all because of him. Because of him, he won't be able to ask him the last question. And he screamed, idiot, what nonsense is he talking about? And anyway, when did he understand everything? And he answered, from the very beginning. He frowned and shouted in confusion. What? He said that the last time they hid underground together, he knew he had plenty of hidden weapons. It was hard not to notice, given the constrained movements of his body. It was as if he were carrying something at waist level. The only reason he hadn't gotten rid of it, even knowing the truth, was very simple. He was interested in watching someone trying to deceive others. He figured it might come in handy in future battles. In response, Chulyong gritted his teeth and said, impossible. He abruptly threw several daggers forward and shouted that he had played a flawless role, but the protagonist easily dodged them. Chulyong wondered what he was feeling while he was close, but still, was he really predicting movements? The next second, the protagonist easily deflected all the weapons flying at him and advanced toward Chulyong, then launched an attack, wounding his shoulder. He jumped back and said, no matter how good his hidden weapon was, it was useless if it was known, right? Chulyong glared at him and ran forward, shouting loudly, but the protagonist dealt several slashes, passing his opponent. The next second, Chulyong fell lifelessly to the ground, and the protagonist closed his eyes, sheathing his sword. Afterwards, he looked at the dagger in his hand and thought that this had been a difficult fight. If he hadn't noticed he was hiding a weapon, he could have been in danger. Then he looked back and thought, the spark of life fading in his eyes. As always, his face filled with an obsession with life. Afterwards, he turned and thought, however, this was different. He crouched next to one of the wounded students and, remembering his silhouette, wondered what it would be like to complete his revenge. When he got his revenge, would he be able to smile as calmly? Afterwards, he collected his weapon and walked in the opposite direction. Meanwhile, the creature spoke. Is that him? Using the Huawu sect's basic sword techniques, which aren't particularly valuable in actual combat, to kill assassins is an impressive feat. However, there are many people against him here. If he doesn't level up, surviving in hell will be difficult. The next day, the protagonist ran forward while a group of disciples ran after him, shouting, "Follow him! He's alone! They can't let him get away." One of the disciples aimed a whip, but the protagonist quickly jumped to the side, dodging it. Several more whips flew after him, and one of them slashed across his back. The protagonist gritted his teeth and, turning slightly, thought, they won't let go. If he continues to deal with them like this, he'll die very soon. He needs to come up with a plan. After some time, Hyokrion, standing at the top of the mountain, asked what the situation was. Jingok stood behind him and said that out of 86, only 41 remained alive. He put his hand to his face and said, "After 3 days, only 41. At that moment, the MC defended himself from an attack, and Hyokrion added, "That means only the real deal remains. It's time to reveal their skills. He should give him a map." Jingok handed him the map and said, "Of course." At that moment, the whip twisted, and one of the students grinned and said, "I caught it." But the next second, the protagonist dropped the sword and began running in the opposite direction. The student screamed, "He's running away again." The MC frowned, thinking that, based on his stats and weapon, fighting in the open would be disadvantageous. Then, for starters, at that moment, Hyokrion pointed at the map and said, "They should forbid this area." He pointed to a building surrounded by trees and told him to release ghosts into the Huawu combat hall. Meanwhile, the protagonist climbed the tall stairs, entering the building, while the students following him examined the bloody footprints. They then went inside, and one of them asked, "Is he hiding here?" A desperately cornered rat. No matter how far he ran, he couldn't hide from them. At that moment, the protagonist stood behind them and then launched an attack. The student dodged to the side and shouted, "From behind you! Idiot! Did he seriously think this pathetic trick would work?" Several whips flew at the protagonist, and he began to dodge from side to side, using his sword to block their attacks. At that moment, one of the students shouted, "How did he manage to read all their movements?" The next second, the protagonist swung his sword, piercing the neck of one of the attackers. The others screamed, "Damn it." The next student swung his whip, but then suddenly looked away and thought, "This place is too much." At that moment, the MC swung his sword and attacked the next attacker, and the remaining one thought, "This guy, he lured them here on purpose." And the protagonist thought, "In this confined space, the White Horse Squad's arsenal is limited. The power of this is significantly reduced, and the direction of their technique variations becomes easily discernible. Moreover, individually, none of them pose a threat. If he deals with them one by one, he can win." At that moment, the next student charged, swinging his whip, but the protagonist noticed it from the side and flew forward, causing the whip to fly through the broken window but still hit the protagonist, knocking him aside. He thought, "Damn," and the whip bounced off the wall. Then the student stepped forward and shouted, "This is their chance." His comrade added, "We need to get out of here." Then one of them let out a loud cry, and then, looking ahead, noticed the obstacle he had hit. Wu Moonchung stood in front of them and asked, "What are they doing?" They weren't planning to escape, were they? They started smiling awkwardly and said, "Leader, not at all. It's just that this place is inconvenient for fighting." The next second, Moonchung's whip attacked several students at once, and then he walked forward and said, "It seems it wasn't worth taking these losers who hadn't even reached the advanced level." At that moment, MC peeked out from the corner and, walking forward, asked, "Is he their leader?" Moonchung, smiling, looked at him and said, "His skills are impressive. The technique he used earlier, was it the Huawu technique?" The protagonist said, "He." But before he could finish, Moonchung introduced himself and asked his name. MC asked, "So he." Before he could finish speaking, Moonchung burst out laughing and said that he didn't need to know the name of the one who was about to die. With these words, he swung his whip and it wrapped around his sword. Moonchung smiled and said that he had heard that at the advanced level of the Huawu Hall, they only taught them one sword technique, and that was defensive. At that moment, the protagonist threw down the rest of the sword and thought, does he know about Huawu techniques? How did he know this? Does he have some kind of network of informants that he didn't know about? The next second, Moonchung swirled the whip around himself and shouted, what was he thinking about in the middle of their fight? Then he thrust the whip forward, breaking the floor beneath the protagonist. He jumped to the side and thought that his whip would shatter anything it touched, be it a wall or a person. With this, he had no advantage in fighting indoors anymore. Then he noticed a passage and wanted to run there, but Moonchung's whip stopped him. He held his weapon out in front of him, and then Moonchung walked through the passage and said how disappointing. He swung his weapon and shouted, with such a disgusting sword technique, he would never be able to stand up to the white horse with 9 tails. He then thrust his whip forward, twisting it ever harder. The next second, a ball of whip began to form around the protagonist. Moonchung began to laugh loudly and shouted, the white horse's whip will soon take his life. The protagonist thought, even though the defensive style he had studied at an advanced level could block attacks, he wasn't strong enough to break the horse's whip. In that case, he needed to now. He closed his eyes, recalling the events that had just happened, and then he opened them and launched several attacks. Moonchun looked at this in surprise, laughed slightly, and asked, "Is he trying to struggle to the last? It's useless." His pathetic technique. But before he could finish speaking, the whip fell to the ground and MC flew out, using an extreme lightning strike. A powerful energy was directed straight at Moonchun. As the protagonist flew past him, he said, "What the hell is this?" The next second, he fell lifeless to the ground from multiple wounds, and MC tried to catch his breath, turning around. Then he looked at his trembling hand and thought, Byokro sword technique, just like the instructor said, is an incredibly dangerous style. But the next second, he covered his mouth with his hand, then looked at the clot of blood in his hand and thought, at the same time, this is the most powerful attack he can currently perform. At his current level, it would be difficult to use this technique freely. In any case, he was lucky, but he had wasted too much time here. The restricted area will change soon, so he needs to leave. The next second, he felt a terrifying energy and turning around thought, it can't be. What is he doing here? At that moment, a ghost was looking at him. He wondered, what is a ghost doing here? Had this place really become a forbidden zone during their fight? But he hadn't come here to run away from a fight. If he left the forbidden zone, he then took a step forward and assumed a stance. He thought, great, no reaction, so he can just leave. At that moment, he ran past the ghost, but the next second, a huge snake spirit appeared behind him, and he turned around abruptly. The next second, his head flew off his shoulders. In the present, he dodged its attack and thought that he didn't even feel it strike. Without the beast path, he would have definitely died by now. He landed, then rose to his feet and held his sword in front of him. He thought, it seems his outward calm had deceived him. As soon as he moved beyond the forbidden zone, he would strike. At that moment, he remembered Sao, raising his index finger, saying that when predators hunt herbivores, they are faster, but they can easily catch their prey. Did he know why? Then the main character suggested that it was because most herbivores move in a zigzag pattern. He answered, true. Such prey is harder for predators to catch, and yet a superior beast excels at hunting. This is because they time their attacks to coincide with the movements of the fleeing prey. Then MC asked, how should he deal with this? Sao placed his hands on his waist and said, he said the movements must coincide, right? So what should he do? In the present tense, he thought in such a situation. Then he screamed loudly and thought that he needed to make his movements completely unpredictable. He abruptly ran forward while the ghost grabbed his sword. The protagonist moved from side to side, managing to reach the stairs. He thought, first, the obvious zigzag movement. Then he turned towards the ghost and dodged its attack. He thought then, dodging it with the beast's path. And finally, forcing it open with an unexpected move. MC frowned, looked at it, then noticed the sword presented to his neck. He thought, damn, it's too late. But then he wondered in surprise, why did he stop? Had he really escaped the forbidden area? At that moment, the ghost continued to stare at him, and he thought, in the end, all he could do was run away. Faced with it, he couldn't do anything. He started running in the opposite direction and thought, this is a true master. So his level really is at rock bottom? After a while, the protagonist stopped and, trying to catch his breath, looked at his hand. He thought, having met the ghost, he felt it firsthand. The skills of true masters are on an incomparably different level. The monster that killed his grandfather, he must also possess terrifying combat power. To take revenge, he must surpass that level. At that moment, Pengak was sitting on a nearby rock, wiping his weapon. He looked at the protagonist and asked, is he Yunseol? He had been looking for him for quite some time. He heard he'd learned the beast's path. The protagonist looked at him and thought, he sounds familiar. Could he really have been involved in this information network? Like that guy with the rope? Then Peng Ak said that someone about to die had no use knowing his name. He swung his weapon, then ran forward and shouted, get it? At that moment, MC stepped aside, and Peng Ak chuckled and said, impressive. With his beast instincts, he quickly predicted the sword's trajectory. As he thought, he could very well be one of the candidates. Then he swung again, and releasing powerful energy, shouted, if that happens, I'll get rid of the demon sect seed right here and now. The protagonist easily repelled his attacks and thought that his sword technique had changed dramatically. But what did he mean by demon sect's seed? At that moment, he remembered Jinha's words and wondered, could this really be this man? He then held his sword out in front of him, blocking another attack from Pengak and thought, I can't get distracted. His hand trembled. He gritted his teeth and thought, wait, this feeling. He waved the weapon aside and thought, this strange, sucking force. At that moment, he remembered his grandfather who had placed his hand on the man's body, and then he asked, what? Grandfather said that the man was killed by the Oho Danman blade. Then MC asked, how did he know that, grandfather? And he looked at his hand and said, not a single external wound, but his bones are completely shattered. This is the hallmark of the Oho Danman blade. Internal strength flows into the body with every contact of the blades. What sin had he committed that attracted the attention of the Peng clan master, who rarely appears in the world of martial arts? In the present, the protagonist shouted, Oho Danman blade. So he is from the Hebei Peng clan. At that moment, Peng Ak looked at him in bewilderment and shouted, what? How did he know? At that moment, he remembered his grandfather saying that another of their famous specialties was a powerful absorption technique. He asked, absorption technique? He replied, one of the fundamental skills of profound strength. The absorption technique is cunning, but it also pulls the user closer to the enemy. It's a double-edged sword that can also injure the attacker. Therefore, in the present, The protagonist thought, using the absorption technique, he will point his sword at the enemy. At that moment, he rushed forward, and Pengak shouted, "Okay, he'll introduce himself properly. He is Pengak of the Hebei sect, and in the name of the Peng clan, he will destroy all the seeds sown by the demonic sects." The protagonist then thrust the weapon in front of him, and he shouted in surprise, "What?" He thought he thrust the sword into the ground. He then attacked in front of him, but MC abruptly jumped to the side, then kicked the enemy's body, jumping back. Pengak clutched his side, and the protagonist jumped back, grabbing his sword. He thought it worked. The next second, Pengak, still clutching his wounded side, said, "Demon spawn, he's using dirty tricks." And the protagonist thought, although he succeeded, it seems the effect wasn't particularly powerful. Well, after all, this is a durable body, subjected to long years of training. And yet, he definitely found a way to counter them. He remembered what Sojin said, the late strike technique. The instant you collide with the enemy, true speed lies in being even a split second faster. Then the protagonist took a stance and thought, by turning the absorption technique upside down, he can attack even faster. The next second, his opponent cried out loudly, charging, and the protagonist thought, resisting the pulling force, thrusting his sword directly into it, and only slightly changing its direction at the very end. At that moment, he sent the sword straight at the enemy, who looked in surprise as the sword blade cut off several of his hairs and flew past his head. He let out a loud sigh, then jumped back and thought, what just happened? Was he really using an absorption technique? He frowned and thought, impossible. The Heavysex absorption technique is powerful enough to attract even rocks from afar. Even martial artists can barely use such power intelligently. Some kid definitely can't. He then released energy and shouted again. The energy aimed at the protagonist, and he swung his sword and thought, useless. The stronger the absorption technique, the faster his sword becomes. He then launched several slashing attacks, hitting the enemy's torso, and he turned and shouted, how much longer is he going to pull this pathetic trick? At that moment, the protagonist dodged his attack and thought the absorption technique had worn off. The next second, the disciple swung his weapon and shouted that he was strong enough without the absorption technique. He must receive. He gritted his teeth, preparing for the blow. The protagonist thought that this was exactly what he had expected. The first Huawu sword technique, the blue mystical sword technique. He held the sword out in front of him as Pengek flew past him. The next second, cuts appeared on his opponent's body and he dropped the sword, falling to his knees. He asked, really? The protagonist said, yes. He turned slightly and added, the first Huawu sword technique, the profound mystical sword technique. He thought it was quite dangerous to turn a fatal blow from a defensive technique into an offensive one. He had to endure the damage of all those blows himself. Then Pengak said that he never would have thought that someone would interpret it like that. He should wait. Is he just leaving? The MC said that he didn't belong in his place. Pengak looked at him in surprise, then smiled and said, even among those he has to deal with, it turns out there are people like him. How interesting. He hopes they never meet again. After this, the protagonist walked on, and Pengak sank to the ground, breathing heavily. Feeling a presence behind him, he asked, have you come to kill a small timer like him? A ghost stood behind him and reaching for his sword said, Peng Ak of the Peng clan of the Hebei sect. For an orthodox fighter, he was quite useful. Such a pity. Peng Ak closed his eyes and smirking asked, so he knew all along? He replied that he had underestimated the demonic palace. Farewell. With these words, he struck, killing the disciple. Meanwhile, Jinha ran forward, trying to catch his breath when he stopped near a tree and pulled the needle from his wounded arm. One of the students approached him and said, bad luck for him, Jinha. He frowned. Then another student, followed by several others, said, he caught a special game with the mountains of the hellish blood fortress and is still trying to escape. Without an antidote, he'll die anyway. He thought, damn it, who would have thought there were people here so skilled in using poisons? There really is a limit to working alone. Then a student stepped forward and asked, will he try attacking with his left hand? No matter how talented he was, if he only had skills with his right-handed sword, he wouldn't be able to switch instantly. He smiled and added that he should give up. The next second, they leaped forward and fired several shuriken, slicing Jinha's arm. He frowned as he saw this, thinking, damn, he's been hit by a poisoned needle again. If he doesn't take the antidote in this technique cycle, no, it's all over. Then his eyes widened in surprise and he saw the students looking at their comrade lying lifelessly on the ground, screaming, who was that? They're ambushing him. At that moment, MC jumped on the students from behind, and they turned to see it. Then, the protagonist moved from side to side, striking each opponent. At that moment, Jinha looked at him in bewilderment. Then he shouted, he has to wait, he won't hurt him. He extended his hands in front of him, dropping his weapon, and then looked in surprise as MC leaned toward one of the students. He took out a vial and thought, so this is the antidote. Now, he'll be able to deal with the remaining idiots of the hellish blood sect much more easily. Then he walked in the opposite direction, and Jinha, holding his injured arm, shouted at him to wait. He turned slightly and asked what was wrong. He frowned and said that they had already poisoned him. Less than half a technique cycle remained before the poison spread throughout his body. The protagonist looked at him and said that he felt like he was misunderstanding something. He came here to kill everyone, including him. Now the only reason he didn't kill him right away was because he didn't see the point. And Jinha lowered his gaze and said that he was right. Even if he gave it to him, he would soon die. After all, he was just another opponent. But what about it? He hit his chest and shouted that if he gave him the antidote, he would join him. The MC looked at him in confusion and then asked why he would do that. He replied that there were only about 20 people left, and besides them, everyone had already formed groups. No matter how strong he was, he couldn't stand against them alone. But if he worked together with him, who knew their skills, he would definitely gain an advantage. And besides, if he saved him, he swears he would never betray him. The protagonist thought, based on what he had seen so far, he was proud, independent, but did not give the impression of a traitor. He asked, "What are the conditions?" He replied, "As long as there are only 2 of them left, they will fight side by side without pointing blades at each other." He glanced nervously at the protagonist as he looked at the vial, and then he threw the vial to Jinha, who caught it and thanked him. After this, he poured the contents onto his wounded hand, and at that moment, MC looked to the side and thought, "That sound, has another forbidden zone appeared?" Then he looked at Jinha and said that they need to get out of here. He asked, "Why? This place isn't off limits, apparently." He told him to think about it. Most of the areas had already been sealed. And what if another forbidden area appeared? The next second, they were surrounded by a multitude of disciples, and the protagonist added, "All survivors should head here." Well, it's too late. He noticed one of the disciples and thought, this guy is different from the rest. Then, the swordsman reached for his weapon and asked, "What? They'll just wait for someone to attack first? Why not get rid of these 2 first?" Yunseol, who had mastered the Nanya Pavilion's Beastway, and the second Jinha, his swordsmanship is quite good, and he's also studied the other disciples' skills. He shouldn't underestimate him. So, they didn't join any groups and ended up simply teaming up. The protagonist thought he knew it. Everyone knows about them. They exchanged glances, and then Jinha hid the vial in his sleeve. He wondered if this vial contained the powdered antidote he'd recently given him. Was that what he had in mind? The next second, Jinha pointed the antidote at them and shouted, "Unseol, he'll distract them with poison. That way they'll have a chance." Purple dust spread around them, and they began to run in the opposite direction, while the remaining disciples covered their mouths and shouted, "What? The poison of the Hell Blood Sect! Damn it!" At that moment, one of the disciples told them to wait. He shouted, "It's not poison at all. They've been tricked. Hurry, follow them." Jinha, continuing to run forward, turned around slightly and thought that this powder had created a perfect curtain for escape. Open space wasn't advantageous for them right now. They needed to hide in the mountains with caves. He then looked at the protagonist and asked, "He's thinking the same thing, right? We need to find a cave that will work to our advantage." He replied that he knew of one, a cave with a narrow passage but a large interior. Jinha thought, he's already planned that out too? As if one beast technique wasn't enough. Who the hell is this guy? At that moment, the students ran after them, and then Jinha said, "They are here." They stopped abruptly, noticing a peculiar wall. He said, "This fog has always been here?" The MC said, "Something is wrong." At that moment, a huge number of ghosts appeared in front of him, and Jinha said, "Ghosts? Is this a forbidden area?" The protagonist said, "It looks like they are watching them. They deliberately made this place forbidden because they saw them running here." Jinha said, "Damn, what now?" He said, "As long as they do not cross this boundary, they will not attack. If they have to fight anyway, then doing it here is not the worst decision. The forbidden area is behind them, so it is like fighting in a cave with a closed exit." Then Jinha held his sword in front of him and said, "So there is no choice." They prepared to attack, and one of the attackers said, "There is nowhere else to run." They stopped, ready for battle, and then the guy chuckled and said, "Damn bugs, there was no point in delaying. They'll deal with them in one go." The next second, everyone leaped to the attack. At that moment, Hyokrion, watching from the mountaintop, said, "Probably, this will be the final battle, where the 10 demonic masters will be determined." At that moment, several daggers rushed at the protagonist, but he quickly jumped aside, and noticing the attacker in front of him, swung his weapon, delivering several attacks at once. Jinha, meanwhile, also advanced, dispatching everyone in his path. Then he looked up, and noticing a sword approaching, held his weapon out in front of him, blocking the attacker's attack. He then stepped back, and they stood back to back. The students continued to approach them, and then Jinha lowered his trembling hand and asked, "Is this really where he's going to die?" He'd given it all he had, so he had no regrets. And the protagonist, trying to catch his breath, thought, "No regrets?" He remembered his grandfather and thought, "He can't die here." His eyes turned red with rage, and then he swung his weapon so fast that he attacked 2 attackers at once. He rushed forward, then kicked off the ground and continued to move forward, striking again and again. The remaining students screamed, "This idiot, what kind of sword technique is this? They have to kill him first." They leaped at him, and the protagonist remembered Sao's words, telling him to act according to his feelings and instincts. He had already learned his sword technique, hadn't he? The next second, his eyes blazed with rage, and he attacked several attackers at once with several strikes, sending them crashing to the ground around him. He wondered if this was the master of the Sao Pavilion's swordsmanship. If that was the case, then perhaps. The next second, he abruptly thrust his sword out to the side and blocked the attacker's fist. He said, "Gotcha." Then the protagonist felt a powerful energy and his sword began to crack. The next second, it shattered into countless pieces, and the MC was sent flying far back from the powerful energy. Noticing this, Jinha called out in alarm. "Unseol!" The disciple in front of him chuckled and said, "It's a shame, but now he can be considered a corpse." Jinha shouted, "No, he has to get up! Unseol this!" At that moment, the protagonist frowned and reached for his head. Jinha shouted, "This is a forbidden area. The protagonist looked around, then looked up, noticing a ghost approaching. Then a hand outstretched toward him was reflected in its pupils. At that moment, Hyokrion screamed loudly, and the hand stopped near the protagonist's face, while Sao held his sword to the ghost's neck. The protagonist looked at him in surprise and thought, "Master Sao." His eyes began to close, and he fell to the ground. Hyokrion ran up to him and shouted, "Hurry! They must bring the mad doctor here immediately, before the kid dies." And Jingak ran after him, shouting, "Chief Instructor, if we stop the third test now." But before he could finish, Hyokrion declared that he would take full responsibility. He closed his eyes and thought, finally he had found it. The reflexes, the lust to kill, the unwavering heart. He was a rough diamond, with neither flaws nor strengths. A true genius, worthy of becoming a supreme demon saint. After some time, Hua Wimyong sat at the table and asked the head instructor what he was thinking. He began pounding the table and added, "There are 10 candidates who will enter the 10 demon schools. And according to the will of the head of the Beyond Pavilion, 2 more will serve as the ears and eyes of the holy demon. A total of 12. That was the number originally set. He was an elder of the demon path." Then he spoke, but he stopped the test, although there were still 2 left. Punishment for this would follow without fail. Hyokrion said he was already prepared for this. In response, Wimyong wiped his forehead and, sighing, said that envoys from the 10 demon schools would arrive soon. He did not know how they would react to what had happened. Hyokrion replied, "Nothing." The eyes of the 10 demon schools were no sharper than his. After some time, the protagonist opened his eyes, sat up, and asked where he was. He looked around and thought, "The smell of medicine. They must be tending to the wounded here." Then he looked at his body in surprise and thought, "Those wounds have healed." And not only that, but also the internal damage sustained from repeated training. The demon path doctor was far more capable than he expected. The next second, he stepped out into the hallway, and a man approached him, asking, "Are you awake yet, young master?" He asked him to follow him. After that, they went down the stairs, and MC looked in surprise at the room filled with students and workers. He asked, "What is this place?" The man said, "This is the heart of hell." The protagonist looked out the window and said, "The heart." He thought, he's never been here during his exploration of the territory, that's why. Then he sat down at the table and the man asked, "Would you like to order? If he wants to eat something, he can cook." MC looked out the window and, raising a finger, said, "Noodles." 2 bowls of noodles. After a while, 2 bowls of noodles stood in front of him, and he remembered how his grandfather ate noodles with him. After that, Jinha sat down across from him and said he must like noodles to order 2 bowls. The protagonist looked at him and asked, "Jinha, what's wrong?" He looked away, then closed his eyes and thanked him for saving him. If it weren't for him in that last battle, he would have become a wandering spirit, wandering through the clouds. The protagonist asked, "Saved him?" He simply finished off the enemy that caught his eye. He said, "Wait, so he doesn't know?" After the 3rd trial, there were supposed to be 12 people left. However, the head instructor interrupted the trial to save him. In the end, there were 14 survivors. So he really is alive thanks to him, and wanted to thank him for that. Although he's not the type to say things like that, so he really didn't know anything? Well, after all, 4 days had passed since he lost consciousness, and the protagonist frowned and said that he thought it was only 1. Jinha laughed in response and remarked that he was lucky a mad doctor was there. MC thought, mad doctor, he was once known as a man with a divine hand and the greatest healer. But when he failed to cure his beloved's illness, he fell into madness, stricken with atrophy. They say he can save anyone who still breathes, no matter the wound. So that's who cured him. If only Grandpa had met him before he died. Jinha then said he had more to tell him. Chatter had whetted his appetite, so they should eat first. Those assassins they fought were elites sent by the 10 demon schools. They say the demon chooses its successors based on their evaluation. The protagonist said that's why their martial arts surpassed even the instructor's skills. Did he know why the head instructor saved him? He replied that he was curious himself. It seemed he had decided to include him in the War of the 10 Demons. Maybe his school was somehow connected to them, or maybe he knew him? But MC shook his head and said that wasn't true, and there was no connection. He replied, then everything was even stranger. The head instructor had been severely punished for this. From what he'd heard, he'd resigned from his post and returned to the path of the demon. The protagonist thought there was so much he couldn't understand. Someone completely unrelated to him had risked punishment and condemnation to save his life. After a while, he uttered that sound. Gina rose from the table and said, the time has come, they must go. The sound summoned everyone remaining in hell. This meant the Supreme Council of the 10 demon schools had arrived. After a while, all the students gathered in the hall and several people walked forward. MC frowned and thought about how quiet it was. So many people had arrived, but not a single footstep could be heard. The next second, they stopped, and Bolsa looked ahead thoughtfully. Afterwards, he pointed his finger at one of the students and asked, does he wish to become the successor of the Death Command School? He was the head of the Death Command School's branch. At that moment, Yun Moonho, standing next to the protagonist, placed his hand on his chest and asked, is he addressing him? He replied, right, Moonho, he should step forward. He wanted to become the successor of the Death Command School. He stepped forward and said that he had only honed sword techniques and had never practiced spearcraft. He replied that it didn't matter. He was born to wield the Death Command spear. Because he had trained his body and talents for the spear while studying swordsmanship, he had failed to achieve greatness even with such strong bones and a strong constitution. With that, he placed his finger on his chest, then turned around and said, If he understands, he should follow him. Moonho ran after him and shouted, "Okay." At this moment, the head of the blood-forged castle of 10,000 poisons, Venerable Chokyakon, laughed lightly and said it was his turn. He introduced himself, and the disciples thought, Venerable Yakon is a poison master, capable of killing all living things within a 30-zhang radius with a single wave of his hand. Then he extended his hand and said, "Jinha, he wants to become the successor of the blood-forged castle." They looked at him in bewilderment and thought, they've called him a sword genius since childhood, and now they want him to join the castle, a school that trains poisoners? He said, "The most terrible poison in the world is the poisonous heart." Even before the third trial began, he tried to use the girl from the battle hall to kill all the other disciples, didn't he? And when that failed, he killed her to cover up the evidence. The next second, Jinha shouted that it was her idea all along, and she was the one who tried to kill him first. Calling it murder was an exaggeration. He closed his eyes and said he didn't blame him. The fact that he could take so many lives without hesitation for his goal meant his nature was suited to the poisonous arts of the blood-forged castle. It was even admirable. He might consider himself a talented swordsman, but that alone wasn't enough to make him look down on the martial arts world. Only a select few could crush the martial arts world with a blade. He extended his hand and added, "He has far more talent with poison than with a sword." Then Jinna glanced to the side and thought, the chosen few. He said he'd first learned to use a sword during the 10th Palace tournament, but his abilities were no less than his own, honed for 10 years. In that case, he clenched his fist and said he would join the blood-forged castle. After that, they walked toward the exit, and Yakon told him to follow him. Then the current greatest demonic sword, Hyakon of the Rainflame clan, stepped forward. He introduced himself, and then the disciples began to think, the disciple of the previous Rainflame clan master, the greatest demonic sword himself. Who does he plan to choose? Please let it be him. And then he said, he's Yunsul, right? Even the Qing leader praised him, and Elder Dan too. He also inherited the Chan leader's Zhongro Musan, didn't he? The protagonist confirmed this, and he turned around and said that he looked forward to his future achievements. The clan's martial arts are incomprehensibly profound. Please, he must hone them diligently. But at that moment, the protagonist said he would not join the Rainflame clan. He asked in surprise, "What? What did he just say?" He released a powerful energy and turning around shouted, "He dares to reject the main school's offer?" The MC sank to his knees from the powerful energy and muttered through clenched teeth that he had heard it was possible to refuse the offer. But he asked, refuse the main school's offer and choose another. Where was he planning to go? He replied, Nanya Pavilion. Hyukon shouted in irritation, Nanya Pavilion? Huh? Of all places, the most dilapidated Nanya Pavilion? How dare he insult the main school? The protagonist thought even his simple aura seemed to be breaking his body. This is the greatest demonic sword. At that moment, Sao stood in front of the protagonist and the MC looked at him in surprise. The demonic sword screamed, "How dare he, a mere vice pavilion leader, block his path?" At that moment, the disciples present thought in surprise, is he actually willing to draw his sword in front of the demonic sword? Has he gone mad? And the protagonist asked, Master Sao? Demon Sword asked, did he dare to be arrogant, thinking that his friendship with Qing's head would protect him? He thought that if the demonic one went berserk, the other candidates could also be caught up in this and killed. He should stop them now. The next second, the demonic sword reached for its weapon, but the next second the man said, well, everyone's suddenly so nervous. He walked forward and, smiling, suggested they stop there. Danshan, the leader of the Nanya Pavilion, asked with a smile if he could stop for his sake. One of the women inquired that, in any case, the Nanya Pavilion had to take at least one person with them, right? Hyugon began to walk away with a grumpy expression and replied that if they were going to take him, they should do it quickly, before his sword slipped from its sheath. Danshan happily thanked him and remarked that it was time for them to go too. The protagonist was surprised to think that that aura was filled with a strong desire to kill him. If they hadn't stopped him, it would have been the end of him. After a while, Sao smiled and remarked that his skills had improved dramatically since their last meeting. The protagonist replied that it was all thanks to him teaching him beast sense. The man chuckled and remarked that he hadn't expected him to choose their pavilion. He explained that he simply felt the direction of the Nanya Pavilion suited him well. After that, Danchon said with a smile that they were there. This was the Nanya Pavilion. The MC, looking around, was surprised to find that he'd expected a quiet atmosphere. But here, everything was different. The deputy pavilion leader asked if he was surprised. Unlike other sects, dominated by nearby markets, their pavilion was quite self-sufficient. He wondered if there weren't any disciples his age at the Nanya Pavilion. Danchian replied that some young men had come, having heard of the pavilion from legend, but most of them either died or fled during training. He looked at the old house and remarked that from now on, it would be his home. If he needed anything restored, he should contact the blacksmith Wang Shi over there. He would help him with any tools he needed. Now, it was time for him and Sao to go. The master, smiling, patted him on the back and told him it was time. He should continue his training. MC wondered if he really wouldn't stay here. Danshan explained with a smile that Sao was in charge of the secret transmission hall. Even to protect him, he lacked the strength or authority to mindlessly confront the demonic sword. Everyone had to pay for their actions. He wondered then if he was really leaving now because of this. Sao replied that he shouldn't worry about it. It was only a small punishment. It wouldn't take long, and he shouldn't even think about slacking off while he was gone. He'd drop by often to check on his progress. The protagonist asked him to take care of himself. Danshan called out to him and pointed out that he wasn't yet an official disciple of the Nanya Pavilion. He had become the heir to the demon's heart, but that didn't make him an official disciple. The weak would never become a disciple of their pavilion. MC asked, so if he became strong enough, he could become a disciple of the pavilion without any additional procedures? Danqian happily agreed, adding that they didn't care about formalities or meaningless rituals. Each of their disciples was the face of the pavilion, so no one here needed to make speeches or swear allegiance. Because of this, he could worry about nothing but training in martial arts and becoming stronger. Strong enough to be recognized as a true disciple of the Nanya Pavilion. Everyone here was his mentor, but whether they would teach him or not was entirely up to them. After some time, the protagonist began to climb the Ironstaff Peak mountain and thought that it was only a short distance before he reached the summit. He remembered Danqian's earlier instructions to climb the Ironstaff Peak. There, he would find a master who would teach him the best internal cultivation techniques. MC had now climbed the mountain, where Yahello was already waiting for him. Gumgung, the teacher, who, upon seeing him, remarked, so, this is who was chosen as the successor to the Nanya Pavilion's demon heart. The protagonist folded his hands in surprise and agreed. The monk said he came here to learn an internal cultivation technique. He had already cultivated internal power, but yearned to reach the higher realms. He could feel the chi emanating from his body, and this was not consistent with the level of a beginner. Something like this must have been systematically built from a young age. The protagonist, perplexed, replied that until recently he had been an embalmer's assistant all his life, and had never practiced internal cultivation techniques before. The teacher approached him and said, so this means he's dealing with one of two things. Either he's the biggest liar in this world, or he's managed to learn the cultivation technique in his dreams. Confused, he replied, he swears he's not lying to him. He can see for himself. The monk grabbed his hand and asked, so that means he can destroy all the chi in his body, right? MC agreed with a serious expression. Suddenly, the teacher was horrified and realized that his body was overflowing with chi, but it wasn't circulating. This simply meant he was blindly accumulating chi in his dantian without any current or use. Such a thing was simply impossible under normal conditions. He squeezed his hand even tighter and exclaimed, who is he? Who taught him how to accumulate chi? The protagonist, perplexed, asked, what do you mean, a way to accumulate internal energy? The teacher asked if he had learned anything about calming his mind or controlling his breathing in the past. He agreed and added that he had learned a breathing method from his grandfather. The man indicated that he should demonstrate it. The protagonist applied the technique and began accumulating chi. The monk, watching this, was shocked to think that he was circulating his energy while standing. Didn't that mean he could do it in any position? And this breathing method is unusual. He asked if his grandfather taught him this. MC agreed and told him that when he and his grandfather were playing dead, he told him that one can breathe freely even inside a coffin. Gumgung explained that this isn't just a breathing method, but also a way to accumulate internal energy within one's dantian and build powerful internal energy. This method is called the breathing and energy circulation method. This is different from internal arts, which allows one to freely use the energy accumulated in one's body. His dantian already accumulated as much internal energy as a martial artist would accumulate over a decade of diligent training. What was his grandfather's name? The protagonist replied that his surname was Bu, and his given name was Chan Yang. The monk said that, as far as he knew, there was only one person with that name in the entire martial arts world. He was the former deputy head of a demonic cult, known as the greatest master of the demonic saber. The demonic saber of the 7 branches, Chan Yang. He wondered in surprise that his grandfather was the deputy head of a demonic cult. No, that couldn't be true. Why would he work as an embalmer, especially with the bodies of unknown people? The monk thoughtfully remarked that the breathing method he had mastered was, however, actually a secret art of the Shaolin sect. MC was shocked to think that this was an art of the Orthodox Shaolin sect, so his grandfather was originally a master of the Orthodox sect. If the demonic cult learned of this, his life would be in jeopardy, let alone his participation in this competition. Jumgung smiled and said he had no doubt about it. The demonic cult's network had surely already thoroughly investigated his past and family connections. Of course, they couldn't possibly know about this method, but he was only here to teach him the inner art and fulfill his promise to the Nanya Pavilion. He didn't care whether he learned internal energy from an orthodox sect or from the demonic path. However, if he taught anyone else the art he was about to teach him now, no, if he uttered even a single letter of these scriptures, he would kill them, along with everyone associated with them. The protagonist silently folded his hands, implying agreement. Gimgang, seeing this, introduced himself. He wondered in confusion why a Buddhist monk had such an ominous word as blood in his name. The teacher asked if he knew the difference between the internal arts of the Orthodox sect and the demonic path. The internal arts of the Orthodox sect use methods that naturally tune the internal energy in the human body, such as energy circulation and the breathing method he had mentioned earlier. On the other hand, the demonic path uses any necessary means to accumulate internal energy. This allows one to gain powerful internal energy from the very beginning, but such methods contradict the natural structure of the body and the principles of martial arts. Gradually, after much time, The orthodox sect becomes incredibly superior in terms of the purity of true energy and the level of internal energy. But the Reversal Heart Sutra he intends to teach him is completely free from the limitations of demonic martial arts. This internal art is the purest and highest in the world, but all greatness comes at a price. The process of studying the Reversal Heart Sutra was so painful for him that he bit off and swallowed his own fingers. Only a true genius, capable of enduring such pain, will be able to achieve a body perfectly synchronized with the flow of his profound energy. He was once the master of the Heavenly Dragon Temple in Yunnan, but he was accused of violating the prohibition against murder. His profound energy was destroyed and he was expelled. During his recovery, he received help from the Nanya Pavilion, and to repay this debt, he promised to impart his profound art. If he fails to learn the Reverse Heart Sutra, his promise will be broken, so he will now conduct a test. He must use the reverse energy to simultaneously open 365 acupuncture points on his body. To learn the Reverse Heart Sutra, there must be no trace of impure energy in his body. Normally, the acupuncture points open one at a time, but he will break this unspoken rule, causing him to instantly experience terrible pain. If he lacks confidence, he should retreat now. The protagonist calmly replied that he was ready. Jumgang grinned and exclaimed, "May he not regret this." He instantly infused pure energy into his body, followed by a surge of powerful magical energy. The monk mused that when acupuncture points were opened, a person felt such pain, as if their bones were being slowly sawed with a knife. How long could he maintain this confidence? To his surprise, the protagonist, with a calm face, remained standing. He was shocked to think that this boy wasn't just not screaming, he wasn't even flinching. Moreover, the sweat secreted from opening the points had no foul odor. After some time, the opening of the acupuncture points was complete. Gumgung, with a big smile, reflected that there hadn't been a drop of impure energy in his body from the very beginning. He laughed wildly and asked, "His name is Unsol?" From this day on, he would impart the Reverse Heart Sutra to him. After 6 months of training, the teacher began throwing huge stones at him. The MC, with his back to him, didn't even move, and when the stone hit its target, it shattered into tiny pieces, leaving no damage. Junggang noted that he had definitely reached the first level. He reflected that it had taken him only 6 months to master what had taken him 3 years. He had done much better than he expected. Moreover, he had managed to disperse the true qi accumulated within him immediately after learning the circulation technique. He had unlocked his potential and progressed incredibly quickly in such a short time. Moreover, his health had improved significantly. The monk remarked that it was time to begin. After this, the protagonist sat down in meditation and reflected that thanks to him, he had quickly reached the first level. But that was not enough. This circulation technique had 8 levels. He needed to reach at least the 2nd level before leaving this place. Suddenly, a powerful energy emanated from him. Jumgang, noticing this, was shocked to think that this was the 2nd level, the realm of bone and muscle purity. Upon reaching this level, a practitioner's bones and muscles reach peak efficiency, but such drastic changes put undue strain on the body. During meditation, the protagonist began coughing up blood from the intense strain. Gumgang placed his hands on his back and shouted at him to cast aside all unnecessary thoughts and concentrate. He thought that his body was unable to contain his true qi due to the sudden changes. At this rate, he would suffer serious internal damage. He would have to use his original true qi essence. The monk poured his essence in and helped, then fell to the ground. MC, having come to his senses, asked if he had imparted his true qi to him. Why did he do that? He replied that he shouldn't worry about it. If he didn't master everything properly, he wouldn't be able to leave the pavilion. The protagonist reflected that he might seem rude and harsh, but he was actually very caring. He remarked that he would never forget everything he had done for him. Junggang replied that he would not let him forget his existence. The protagonist immediately recalled Sao's words, "Be it hatred or kindness, if he could forget, it was better to forget." He wondered in confusion why they all told him the same thing. The monk said that if he truly wanted to repay him, he should reach the 8th level, the realm of the Great Origin. That was how he could repay him. He himself had only reached the end of the 5th level. Now that he had reached the 2nd level, he no longer needed his instructions. What was important for him now was not delving into the circulation technique, but laying the foundation of martial arts. He should climb the cliff that stands on the western edge of the Nanya Pavilion and train his martial arts there. Let him step foot. The MC folded his arms and told him to take care of himself. Gimgang paused for a moment and then responded in kind. 3 months later, 2 pavilion residents were discussing the return of a substantial divine troop that morning. One of them remarked that he thought they'd been busy destroying the Turquoise Dragon Pavilion. The other chuckled and replied that it made perfect sense. They'd harmed their disciple. Who else but a substantial divine troop would undertake such a mission? The man remarked that it was still pleasant to hear. Wasn't it time for the Wind and Cloud troop to return? He noticed ninjas leaping across the rooftops through the window and asked why they couldn't enter through the gate like normal people. After a while, Baekyeon, the commander of the Wind and Cloud troop of the Nanya Pavilion, stood on the edge of the roof. Dancheon caught up with him and remarked that he was standing as if he wanted to be captured in a painting. Why didn't he just come to the Turquoise Wind Pavilion right away? Why was he standing here and making a scene? Baekhyun turned around and said that this was the Deputy Pavilion Lord. Danshan smiled and pointed out that he had said that when they were alone, he should just call him by his first name. He replied that this was nonsense. The pavilion's rules were already lax enough. However, he was just in time. He was just about to find him. He had heard that he had brought someone with enormous potential to become one of the 10 demonic masters. He had initially been against this plan, so why had he accepted him if he was originally supposed to go to the Fire Rain Sword sect? Danshan replied that it was actually his choice. He had refused the Fire Rain Sword sect's offer. Baekhyun asked in confusion, did he choose them? He replied that he almost clashed with that crazy old demon sword lord, but wasn't he proud of him? He had chosen them. The Wind and Cloud Squadron commander remarked that because of this, the Fire Rain Sword sect hadn't received any of the 10 demonic masters at all. The Sword sect leader himself expressed disappointment. He knew full well that the demonic palace had always been wary of them. Because of this, they had already experienced terrible treatment. Danshan replied that he felt he had been in Jianghu for too long. The purpose of the Nanya Pavilion was to master martial arts, not to strive for political power. Baekhyun nervously remarked that this was merely an ideal. In any case, he had something to do. Where was that demonic master? His position among the 10 demonic masters was now in jeopardy. After some time, the protagonist began training his martial arts. The first thing he did was run silently on water, trying not to drown. A little earlier, on a cliff, he had encountered Go Wall, once known as a great thief, faster than a shadow. The old man said the art he would teach him was a physical technique that blurred the line between movement and martial prowess. The name also came from his nickname, faster than a shadow. All the students who had mastered this art before him were left crippled. Their bodies couldn't handle the ultra-fast transformations. They would see how he fared. After some time, the protagonist achieved mastery in just a month, greatly surprising the teacher. Go Wall joyfully packed his things and declared that finally, someone worthy of inheriting his art had appeared. From now on, this place belonged only to him. He had mastered the basics. Now let him go hone it in real combat. In the present, as MC ran across the water, Danshan and Baekhyun watched. The deputy pavilion leader smiled and said, "So this is Master Gowal's faster than a shadow technique." The commander of the Wind and Cloud Squad noted that this wasn't a technique one could master in such a short time. Could it be that he only started learning the introductory techniques after arriving at the main pavilion? Danshan replied that that was impossible, since he'd only joined 6 months ago. Just a month earlier, he'd learned the reverse limit technique from Huel Gemgang atop the Iron Staff. Baekhyun added that rumors then spread that he'd mastered the Way of the Beast in just 15 days in the Valley of Hell. Danshan replied that it was true. After they fed him all the polar heavenly essence of Sao, his supernatural neural core had opened up much faster than expected. Baekhyun exclaimed that the Way of the Beast couldn't be mastered that way. There were supposed to be 12 demon candidates, but because of him, there were 14. Has the pavilion master appeared yet? Danshan replied that no, because that's why he's forced to do all this routine work alone. Baekhyun explained that the Demon Candidate project was originally proposed by the Demon Hall. Since then, the 10 demon sects have been filled with discontent. Danshan replied that, unlike the Nanya Pavilion, which revered strength above all else, their heirs had already been chosen, and then they were told they had to pass on their martial arts to some demon candidates. No wonder they were furious. But still, wasn't the true purpose of the project to create assassins capable of destroying the great masters of the righteous faction? Park-hyun pointed out, so he knew all this. But it seemed some of the 10 demon sects never understood this. They even sent their chosen heirs to participate in the tournament. Danshan replied that this wasn't necessarily a bad move. If these heirs possessed top-tier talent, they would have been chosen as demon candidates no matter what. Park-hyun pointed a finger at the protagonist and said that would have been the case under normal circumstances. Because of that child, the only son of the White Horse sect's master, Kong Miryong, died. Danshan asked if the third trial had been agreed upon by the 10 demon sects, right? The loss of a son was a tragedy, but it was inevitable. The White Horse sect wasn't the only one harboring a grudge. The Flower Rain Sword sect raised the issue of the Thunderless Strike form. Someone who wasn't a disciple of their sect had mastered their highest sword technique. Baekhyun replied that their demon sword, Wi Hyokyong, demanded severe punishment. Chon Eun-gwang had already been stripped of his position as sect leader and imprisoned for penance. Danshan asked if they had punished the master, and now they wanted to punish the disciple as well? This is ridiculous. So what exactly are the White Horse sect and the Flower Rain Sword sect demanding? Baekhyun replied that they wanted the boy summoned to the demon hall to test his worth as a demon candidate and to be permanently banned from using a sword. Danshan said this was absurd. They should refuse immediately. He was already a demon candidate and a disciple of the Nanya Pavilion. Ordering one of them not to use a sword was simply ridiculous. At that moment, the protagonist noticed them, quickly ran over, and asked if he had been watching him. The deputy leader agreed with a smile and remarked that he seemed to have mastered the divine arts well. Baekhyun asked if he was the demon candidate from their pavilion. Danshan replied that this boy was in charge of the Wind and Cloud platform. He could just call him Chief. The protagonist introduced himself and greeted him. The Wind and Cloud Squad leader said he was glad he had come. He actually had something he needed to talk about. Danxian stopped him and pointed out that it wasn't worth mentioning, so why relay their words? The MC, with a serious expression, said it was all his fault. He'd take responsibility. Baekhyun remarked that he seemed to have heard everything they were saying. He apologized and added that he'd used the resonating mind skill from the beast path. The squad leader inquired in surprise. Wasn't that a technique that expanded one's perception through vibrations while at rest? And he used it while performing his divine art? The protagonist agreed and explained that while performing his divine art, he followed the waves spreading across the surface of the water to embody the beast path. Danxian smiled and remarked that he was always like that. Wasn't that amazing? Baekhyun, shocked, agreed and asked, "How about we entrust it to him this time?" The deputy head asked, perplexed, if he meant sending him to the demon hall to undergo this farce called a test. It was simply a ploy to kill him. Baekhyun replied that the whole purpose of the demon hall's request was to save face for the White Horse sect master, who had lost his son. They most likely had no intention of taking his life. That's why the demon hall itself had been designated as the test site, not the White Horse sect or the Flower Rain Sword sect. If they rejected this proposal, the reclusive pavilion master himself might be forced to intervene, which would lead to major problems. Danxian remarked that even so, sending such a rookie there wasn't the best idea. MC calmly replied that he would go. He was heading to the demon hall. As the chief had said, all they wanted was to preserve their pride. Killing a mere rookie like him would only further humiliate themselves. More importantly, as a disciple of the Nanya Pavilion, he had no intention of backing down from a challenge. Baekhyun added that he was right. It was bound to happen sooner or later. They might as well accept their demand now and ensure they never made any further claims. Danxian said that if he passed the test, he should extract a promise that the matter with the White Horse sect and the Flower Rain Sword sect would be finally resolved. Under this condition, he would allow the Nanya Pavilion disciple, Yunseo, to take the test. The protagonist folded his arms and agreed. Sometime later, he arrived at the Hall of Demons and reflected that when he first entered, he was just an exorcist, ignorant of martial arts. But now, as the successor of the Nanya Pavilion, he once again walked the corridors of the Hall of Demons. One of the guards led him to a building and noted that this was Manbak Hall, the so-called brain of the Hall of Demons. As soon as he entered, someone from Manbak Hall would lead him in. The protagonist reflected that this was the heart of the Demon Hall's strategy and management, rivaling the Central Bureau of the Martial Alliance. And it was here that he would learn the true nature of the trial that awaited him. Inside, the Lord of the Demon Palace's pavilion was waiting for him. A servant noticed that Lord Unsul from the Wandering Beast Pavilion had arrived. The MC folded his arms, introduced himself, and greeted him. Baek Jongchun, the Lord himself, introduced himself in return and remarked with a smile that his chi was far more impressive than he had heard. He had heard about what had happened, right? Because of what had happened, the Demon Palace had found itself in a very strange situation. They couldn't simply ignore the demands of the 10 demon sects. The protagonist wondered if the Demon Palace and the 10 demon sects were the same thing. Jongchon asked, didn't anyone explain to him what was going on? It seems the Wandering Beast Pavilion is still unaware of what's going on in Murim. The Demonic Palace is an alliance of demonic path sects, formed by 10 demonic path sects. They aren't completely united, but they're also impossible to separate. Typically, the Demonic Palace's lord is chosen from among the 10 demonic path sects, but the previous lord wasn't one of them. And not all demonic path sects are friendly toward the Demonic Palace. MC thought he understood everything. The two sides are merely collaborating, so many demonic path sects aren't exactly thrilled about the Demonic Palace. Zhongchun added that, frankly, the 10 demonic path lords' intention isn't to choose successors for the 10 demonic path sects. Their true goal is to cultivate people who will destroy the masters of the righteous path. In other words, the 10 Demon Lord competition was the Demon Palace's plan to eliminate the Righteous Alliance's leadership. The 10 Demon Lords initially rejected the idea, but they continued to persuade them until they sent their disciples. And it was at the 10 Demon Lord competition that these people met their deaths, and all because of him. For all these reasons, the Demon Palace now found itself in an extremely awkward position. That's why it wanted to meet him, to punish him under the guise of a test. He understands that, right? The protagonist calmly agreed. Zhongchun noted that he saw that he had come prepared. He agreed, and added that he would accept any test, no matter what it was. The Palace Lord said, well, he'd already talked too much. It was time for them to get down to business. The Fire Rain Sword Sect and the White Demon Temple had done him a favor. The right to enter the Pavilion of 10,000 Demonic Truths, the palace's repository of martial arts. He took out the item and noticed it was the Golden Monkey's golden plate, necessary for entry into the Pavilion of 10,000 Demonic Truths. It only granted access to the first floor of the 3. The first floor is the lowest in terms of access. But even on the first floor alone, there are 25,000 different martial arts treatises. This will be a huge advantage for him, but it also means his chances of successfully passing this test are slim. That's why they're showing him this favor, to silence the bad rumors. The test is to withstand 5 blows from a martial artist chosen by the White Demon Temple. That's the entire test. The head instructor gave up his position during the competition to ensure his passage. He asked him many times why he did this, but all he said was that he would find out for himself. He hoped he would see the answer to this question. After this, Jongchon handed him the item. After some time, the protagonist left the room and met Jingak in the hallway. The master approached him and remarked that he had heard the news. He must have come for the test. He agreed and asked why he was there. The master replied that he had extensive connections within the all-encompassing pavilion. He assisted the headmaster on Hell Island because he was acting as the lord of the all-encompassing pavilion's deputy, who was absent at the time. Had he come to the pavilion of 10,000 demonic truths for the test? MC looked at the golden plate and agreed. Jingak remarked that since he had once been his disciple, he would give him some advice. Zhonghu is a terrifying place. No good deed is done without reason. Usually, there is some hidden intent or plot behind it. The same was true in this situation. But despite all this, he was confident that even amidst danger, he would be able to find opportunity. After all, a tree grows from its roots. Let him remember his words and do his best. He hoped that everything would work out. The protagonist thanked him, and after a while, he arrived at the pavilion of 10,000 demonic truths. The gates opened before him, followed by endless corridors filled with countless books. MC stepped inside and wondered in surprise that this was no ordinary library. Were all these books on martial arts? He picked up a few books and wondered if this really was a trap. Secret martial arts techniques might be collected here, but he wouldn't be able to master any of them in a day. If he got carried away and tried to master everything at once, he would only be wasting his time. He believed that this was exactly what they were counting on. The Fire Rain Sword Sect and the White Demon Temple wanted to confuse him, to disrupt his concentration. He couldn't give in to that. He had to find opportunity amidst danger. A tree grows from its roots, and these are its roots. Could this really be what he thought? The protagonist jumped up and quickly started searching for a book. After a while, he found a book titled Wandering Beast Treatment, and then smiled, noting that something from the Wandering Beast Pavilion was there after all. He wondered what kind of technique it was. MC quickly flipped through the book and then saw the 100% Rasengan technique. Sometime later, the day of the test arrived. He arrived at the great training hall of the Demonic Palace, where they were already waiting for him. Gok Gyobong, a former martial artist of the Demonic Palace, introduced himself and said that he lived behind the Elder's Pavilion. He had come to observe him during the test. Sitting nearby was Yu Un-song, the leader of the Secret Shadow Squad. He is from the Fire Rain Sword Sect. Another man was Nong Gak, the leader of the Profound Mystery Hall. He is from the Wandering Beast Pavilion. And finally, the last one was Go Gunpyeong. He leads the Silent Dragon Squad. He is from the White Demon Temple. This trial is being held at the request of the White Demon Temple and the Fire Rain Sword Sect. The White Demon Temple wishes to test his qualifications to become one of the 10 Demon Masters. The Fire Rain Sword Sect, however, claims that the exemption granted to him was unfair. If this young man passes the trial, will the White Demon Temple and the Fire Rain Sword Sect promise not to return to the past? All the other representatives agreed. Jobong snapped his fingers and said that they would then begin the trial. Gunpyeong approached the protagonist first, saying that if he could block 5 of his attacks, he would pass. After this, the young man began casting magic and recalled how the abbot of the White Demon Temple ordered him to kill him. He reflected that he was still young and did not want to tarnish the reputation of the Wandering Beast Pavilion. So with the 5th attack, he would simply rip off both his arms. At the moment of attack, the protagonist nervously thought that he was completely unprepared for this blow. He's so fast. Yet despite the ability's casting speed, he managed to dodge. Gunpyeong thought he'd mastered the basics flawlessly. Afterward, he used another technique, causing the bandages on his hands to fly toward the protagonist. MC nervously wondered, "What is this?" Instead of retreating, he ran straight into the countless blades created from the bandages, thus blocking the attack. Gunpyeong was surprised to notice that the second technique was called White Demon Spirit Descent. He'd seen through the false move. He'd mastered the path of the wild beast, but now he had to be more careful. The third technique was called White Demon Chaotic Shadow. Gunpyeong used the skill and literally unleashed a hail of attacks. The protagonist thought that if this continued, he wouldn't be able to distinguish a real strike from a fake. Then he'd dodge them all. He began to swiftly dodge each attack, but still managed to get slightly injured. When the technique ended, MC reflected on how he'd barely dodged it using the Swift Ghost skill. If he'd truly intended to kill, or attacked immediately after, he'd be dead. Gunpyeong considered this in surprise. He thought he'd deal him a couple of serious wounds with that strike. It seemed he wouldn't be able to cut off his arms at this rate. After that, he immediately used the 4th technique, White Demon Heart Strike. The protagonist nervously considered the fact that he couldn't even read that technique. He'd die if he couldn't do it. He remembered reading the book he'd found in the library and realizing that, unlike the beginning, the later chapters detailed the weaknesses of the Wandering Beast path. Perhaps all those insults at the beginning were specifically written so that only the disciples of the Wandering Beast Pavilion would read them. The Wandering Beast path isn't omnipotent, relying solely on instinct. That's what beasts do. A martial artist in Miram must think. Enhance your senses only when absolutely necessary. Right now, just before the attack, MC enhanced his senses and dodged incredibly quickly. Gunpyeong, terrified, wondered if he'd dodged the White Demon's heart strike. Even the White Demon Temple's martial artists had trouble dodging this technique. It all became clear to him. Now he saw why the White Demon Temple and the Fire Rain Sword Sect had teamed up to kill this child. The root of all future problems must be eliminated in a timely manner. Gunpyeong used the final, 5th technique, White Demon Divine Serpent, and created an incredibly fast blade, rushing straight at the protagonist. He tried to dodge, but the blade ricocheted off the ground and changed its trajectory. MC, horrified, wondered if this weapon was pursuing him. Gunpyeong wondered if this technique wouldn't stop until it drew blood, so it was only a matter of time before his neck was cut in half. The protagonist thought there was no way to avoid it. Well, since it had come to this, he used the unrivaled lightning technique and tried to counterattack, but the white demon's blade didn't stop. The protagonist thought that even using unrivaled lightning at its maximum power, he could barely contain it. If this continued, he would die. Suddenly, from such a powerful force, his blade shattered into tiny pieces, and the white demon's blade itself pierced his body. MC flew into the wall, and coughing up blood, with the last of his strength, he picked up the broken sword, and then stood up, looking his opponent straight in the eye. Gunpyeong, in wild shock, thought that his sword was shattered, his right arm was completely broken, but his fighting spirit hadn't dimmed one bit. Who is he? No, what is he? If he didn't get rid of him here and now, he would become a serious threat to the current leaders. He needed to finish him off. He clenched his fist furiously, but was stopped by Nongak, who noted that the 5 forms they had agreed upon had expired. Gunpyeong wrenched his hand from his grasp and asked if he was being too rude. He replied that if he refused to honor the agreement, their sect would abandon its pact with the demonic division. Eunseong intervened, pointing out that this boy had used unrivaled lightning during the test. Considering the reason it was created, he had to admit he had failed with the final form. Nongak responded that this was nonsense. Where in the agreement had it been stated that he couldn't use it? Besides, he had now demonstrated a far from frivolous decision. If Great Master Cheon had seen this, he would have been pleased. Eunseong angrily told him to put that thought aside. Nongak replied, "Let him think about it." When Master Gunpyeong used the White Horse Sect's peak technique, the boy blocked it with Grandmaster Cheon's best move. This meant the Fire Rain Sect's derivative sword art had surpassed the White Horse Sect's peak technique. Shouldn't the latter be ashamed in such a situation? He was slightly concerned about the relationship between the Fire Rain Sword and White Horse sects. They had long been on good terms, but this incident could ruin everything. Eunseong noted that this test had been arranged in secret, and only a few people in the pavilion were allowed to know about it, so this news won't be able to spread. Nongak asked if they would honor the established agreement, right? Jobong agreed and added that, as of today, Eun-sol, a disciple of the Nangya Pavilion, is once again considered a participant in the 10-demon trial. The ban on using a sword has also been lifted. Nongak turned to the protagonist and remarked that he had done an excellent job. As a disciple of the pavilion, he hadn't disgraced himself in the least. At this point, the protagonist himself was still in a fighting stance, despite severe injuries. Nongak hugged him and said that now that they had sorted this out, he could breathe a sigh of relief. Sometime later, the MC woke up on a bed in an unknown room and wondered where he was. Why? Every time he lost consciousness, did he wake up in an increasingly luxurious place? How did the trial end? He thought he had held out until the end, but he couldn't remember the final moments. And besides, he had no idea how much time had passed. What would happen to him now if he failed this test? Well, he wouldn't get that answer anytime soon, so for now he'd focus on circulating his internal energy and catching his breath. The protagonist had assumed a meditative pose when he suddenly felt something strange and wondered what it was. Where did such a quantity of true internal energy come from in his body? He remembered Gyeomgung saying that his dantian already contained as much qi as an experienced martial artist would accumulate in 10 years of continuous training. Moreover, this qi was pure and true, so awakening his dormant acupuncture points would instantly make him much stronger. MC now wondered if this incident had activated his dormant acupuncture points. This was the 3rd level of the Reverse Heart Sutra, the Reverse Firelight. Mastering this, one gains immunity to both heat and cold. So did that mean he was no longer afraid of extreme temperatures? He still couldn't believe it. At that moment, Jin Sol, Jeokbung's assistant, entered the room, noticing that he had woken up. The protagonist asked where he was and how the trial had ended. The girl replied that this was the House of the Red Demon, the abode of the Senior Lord. He was shocked to realize that this wasn't a hospital, but his own home. Even someone as distant as he had heard of the Senior Lord of the demonic division, the blood demon Jeokbung. He was one of the 3 greatest demonic masters, having achieved the highest heights in the world of martial arts. But what was he doing in the house of such an important figure? Jin Sol introduced herself and explained that the Lord had ordered her to escort him to the inner hall, so he should follow her. The Lord himself was waiting there. After a while, they went outside. MC, looking around, thought about the huge garden, as if he were in paradise. Jin Sol noted that they had arrived. A pavilion appeared before him, and the master himself sat inside. When the protagonist sat down across from him, Jeokbung said he'd passed the Fire Rain Sect and the White Demon Temple's test. He congratulated him on this. He thanked him and took a sip of tea. The master asked how the tea tasted. The protagonist replied that he wasn't sure. He wasn't much of a tea connoisseur. Jeokbung pointed out that he'd said he worked as a gravedigger. He'd forgive him for asking. After that, the pavilion lord introduced himself. The MC was surprised to think that the bloody demon who had swept through Jenghu and slaughtered countless righteous martial artists was an old man who looked and acted like a Taoist hermit. If he hadn't heard of him before, he wouldn't have guessed it was him. The protagonist bowed his head and introduced himself. Jeokbung noted that he looked somewhat different from the one he'd been told about. He started studying martial arts late, but his joints and muscles are unusually flexible. He also has a strong foundation of internal energy. The protagonist replied that in his youth, he often amused himself by climbing into coffins and learning how to breathe properly. Only recently did he realize that he had been unknowingly mastering cultivation techniques all this time. Jeokbung said he understood everything. The reason he brought him here instead of to the healing hall was because he wanted to speak with him privately. Once he completed his training at the Wandering Beast Pavilion, he was to join the Demonic Palace. Yes, the Wandering Beast Pavilion is one of the 10 demonic sects, but their structure and practices are very different from the others. In about 3 years, when he joins them, he will meet the Lord of the Demonic Palace and accept him into the Dark Sky Squad. The MC was shocked to realize that this was one of the most elite squads in the Demon Palace, along with the Heaven Slayer Squad and the Soul Extermination Squad. Jeokbung added that he would then embark on a path leading to the heights of power in the Demon Palace. What would he say to that? The protagonist replied that he was forced to decline the offer. Jeokbung, radiating an incredibly powerful aura, asked why. He explained that learning the martial arts of the Wandering Beast Pavilion required him to risk his life. If such a high position were guaranteed to him even before he began training, he would become complacent, lose his guard, and fail to master the arts of the Wandering Beast Pavilion. Jeokbung laughed incredibly loudly and exclaimed that he loved it. This is exactly the attitude a true martial artist should have. The MC thought it was a powerful shockwave. The sheer energy contained in his laughter made his insides clench. The master remarked that he would be watching him. He would see how much he had grown in these 3 years. They would meet again that day. The protagonist wondered if he was signaling that he could go. He said goodbye and began to leave. Afterward, an assistant approached Jeokbung and said that he had never seen anyone reject his offer, although he was precisely the type capable of such a thing. The master replied that they would watch him for now. They would see whose side he ultimately chose. After some time, having walked a fair distance, the protagonist, horrified, thought he had almost died. He thought the test he had just undergone would be the most life-threatening, but it turned out that being in the hands of such a person was far more frightening. Suddenly, a man approached him, patted him on the back, and asked if he was okay. The protagonist realized they were on a city street, agreed, and reflected on how he hadn't even noticed how he'd reached the outskirts of the city. This tranquil panorama, something he hadn't seen in a long time, was something he'd never imagined would become a rarity. When had he changed so much? He'd become too immersed in a life he didn't want. As if to prove it, someone was watching him. The MC began to walk away, glancing around. Noticing a strange silhouette, he thought he should first get a weapon. The protagonist approached a blacksmith and said he was looking for something suitable for training. The man gestured toward a box of weapons and said he could choose any. He'd sell it for 5 nyons. After that, the protagonist bought a sword and left the city. After a while, he approached a wheat field and told them to come out. Several mercenaries emerged from the bushes, one of whom noted his sharp gaze. Before he could leave Murim after 3 years of training, he would kill him here. MC replied that he didn't know who they were, but he didn't want to kill them. Tell them to put away their swords and leave. The mercenaries exclaimed that he was going to die now. He couldn't escape from here. He noted with a serious expression that they were leaving him no choice. The protagonist drew his sword and threw the scabbard on the ground. One of the mercenaries remarked that drawing his sword was pointless. His life was already in their hands. After that, all the opponents began to surround him. He, remaining calm, considered the idea of them surrounding him. Were they really planning to attack all at once? Suddenly, all the mercenaries began attacking him, but the protagonist began to respond with deft parries and dodges. After several attacks, he began to think that their attacks were following one after another in a chain, without the slightest respite. Judging by how well they worked together, they had been working together for a very long time. Their teamwork is impeccable. But when viewed through the lens of the wild beast, the gap in individual skill between them is glaring. If he exploits this and uses it against them, he'll defeat them. MC dashed forward with lightning speed and cut down one of the mercenaries. The other, watching this, was amazed to think he'd figured out the weakness of the Wudong sect's supreme sword formation. Had the Demon Palace really taught 10 demonic masters to destroy orthodox formations? He shouted, "Make everyone adopt the 3rd formation." Instantly, the mercenaries changed their formation, placing 3 in front and 2 in the back. The protagonist thought there was no point in changing their formation. Their weakness was their difference in skill. This wouldn't change anything. As he attacked, he made a lightning-fast dash and struck down 2 mercenaries at once. The others, watching this, horrified, said that the Demon Palace had leaked false information. They thought he hadn't mastered the highest sword techniques. MC replied that this wasn't martial art anymore. It was his desperate fight for survival. They were losing because they believed too much in their superiority in a fight where lives were at stake. The mercenary reflected in horror that he had always thought they were the hunters. Their enemies were the prey, and they were the predators. He believed they could destroy any opponent as long as they were within their sight. But now they were the prey. The protagonist pointed his sword in their direction and said that they would start over. One of the opponents remarked that he might be much stronger than they thought. They should retreat, report what had happened, and gather their forces. Suddenly his ally, the 2nd mercenary, thrust his sword into him and exclaimed that they would not retreat. To die with your back to the enemy would be to trample your honor. The protagonist inquired if honor was truly more important to them than life. The young man turned around and replied that he didn't know how it was with them, the demonic masters, but they didn't take up the sword for personal glory. They fought for honor. He replied that honor couldn't be taken to the grave. MC used the skill Unrivaled Lightning and Thunder and delivered a lightning-fast strike that pierced all the mercenaries. The last man, bleeding, said that he had already become one of them. He would curse him even in the afterlife. After that, he fell to the ground and died forever. The protagonist looked at the battlefield and thought about the landscape strewn with corpses and soaked in blood. Who would have thought he would see such a thing, even after leaving the island of hell? He realizes once again that the place where he stands is already hell, and that escaping the cycle of hatred and retribution is impossible. However, this is also the price he must pay for the path chosen for revenge, the karma he must bear. Suddenly, Baekyeon arrived behind him on a carriage, remarking that this was an interesting sight. Tracking him down wasn't difficult. This was a real headache. MC asked what had happened. He replied that nothing had happened. For now, they needed to return to the Wandering Beast Pavilion. Sometime later, arriving at the pavilion itself, Danshon smiled and remarked that it hadn't been easy for him. He had heard everything and was sincerely proud of him. The ordeal must have been difficult. Was he injured anywhere? The protagonist agreed and added that he had been treated at the residence of the senior pavilion leader. Danshon, surprised, asked if he had met with the senior pavilion leader. After that, he told them the whole story. The vice chairman smiled and said he understood everything. So that's why the Fire Sword sect and the White Demon Temple were so willing to acknowledge the results. He hadn't even known that old man was still around. MC wondered if the position of senior pavilion leader was really that important. He knew he was strong personally, but still. Baekyeon explained that the Demon Palace had a palace lord, a senior pavilion master, and 10 demon sects, dividing power 3 ways. The senior pavilion's power was especially strong, as it commanded all the martial artists of the previous generation. Furthermore, senior pavilion leader, Jeokbung, was secretly building up his own strength. Danshon said he couldn't believe he wanted to meet him alone, so he really had done well. MC wondered if this was more important than he thought. He wondered if there was anything else he wanted to report. Baekyeon replied that they were being ambushed. Danshon gripped his teacup in anger, cracking it. He furiously asked who dared ambush their student. He replied that it was the Miram Alliance. Judging by their weapons and equipment, they must be the chief strategist's subordinates, either the Autumn Wind Troop or the Flying Cloud Troop. Danshon sighed and said he understood. So they were planning to blame the chief strategist entirely if anything went wrong. But attacking a child who had just entered the Wandering Beast Pavilion? Baekyeon replied that he thought it was because of rumors of his outstanding talent. He would become a formidable opponent in the future, so they must have tried to kill him while he was still weak. Danshon reflected that he hadn't even properly mastered martial arts yet. 10 demonic sects, the Elder Pavilion, and now the Miram Alliance all had their eyes on him. Well, the hero must endure his trials. He'll have to believe it will help the child grow stronger. MC said he had a favor to ask. He'd heard of the Divine Founding Squad. It's a squad that eliminates those who try to harm the Wandering Beast Pavilion. He wants to join them and learn martial arts through real, lived experience. Baekyeon exclaimed, "What is he talking about? This squad is filled with the toughest and most aggressive people in the entire pavilion. Even their leader, Sojeon, is known for her terrible temper. They say she killed Wandering Beast Pavilion students, deeming them unworthy under the guise of a trial." The protagonist replied that if he dies because he's not good enough, it will be his fault alone. He wants to become stronger as soon as possible, and he believes the most effective way is to participate in real battles and observe how martial artists fight in real conditions. Danshon chuckled and noted that it seemed like he and Baekyeon weren't on the same page this time. He wanted to trust this kid's decision. After all, he had confidence. The next mission was the Valley of Wind and Thunder. He thought it would be ideal if they took him there as a temporary participant. Baekyeon looked at the protagonist and said that if that was his decision, he would inform Sojeon. Sometime later, at the Thousand Fortunes Inn, the girl herself shouted furiously, "He wants her to drag this brat to the Valley of Wind and Thunder? What, does he think she's some kind of nanny?" Baekyeon replied that it was a direct order from the deputy pavilion leader. So Jeon said that then she would go to him herself and refuse this order to his face. He showed her the tablet and noted that it was the Heavenly Wolf Jade Tablet, the sign of authority of the vice pavilion leader. He was sure she understood what it meant. It meant he had no time to argue with her. This child was not the brat she thought he was. After all, he had overcome the trials of the Fire Rain Sword Sect and the White Demon Temple. So Jeon drank the drink furiously and exclaimed, "There's something wrong with your eyes if they can't see this." She didn't understand why they were all so protective of him. Fine, she'd take him with her, but she would test him. She would see if he was truly worthy of being called a disciple of the Wandering Beast Pavilion. After some time, the party arrived in Wind and Thunder Valley. It was a sect born from heresy. They honed their martial arts through body modification and physique strengthening techniques. To achieve this, they engaged in human trafficking. They are despised by both the orthodox and unorthodox worlds of Miriam. The reason they've managed to survive despite this is because the valley itself is a fortress, as if bestowed by the gods. Because of this, the divine founding squad of the Wandering Beast Pavilion hesitated for a long time before taking on the task. So Jaeyeon said the valley was much larger than she'd heard. One of the members noted that the problem was the strong winds. They were too powerful. They wouldn't be able to cross safely. Furthermore, there were guards there. Should they show their face, the guards inside would immediately cut the bridge. The girl nervously considered that this task was difficult enough without having to babysit this child on top of it. She turned to Jae-woon, the deputy commander of the Divine Founding Squad, and asked if he could handle it. He replied with a smile that he'd have to try. He began tossing daggers across the ravine, aiming straight for the building there. MC, watching this, thought what had just happened looked easy, but this was the body and blade fusion technique he'd learned at the Fire Rain Sword Sect. He really was skilled. So Jeon asked if he thought it worked. Jae-woon replied that inside the building, yes, but he'd have to take a closer look. Perhaps there were hidden mechanisms on the bridge as well. She considered this. She wanted to make sure nothing happened to her squad mates. The girl called out to the protagonist and motioned for him to go first. He calmly agreed and headed toward the bridge. As he approached the abyss, MC considered that in this wind, maintaining his balance wouldn't be possible using normal methods. He'd have to use the absorption technique to plant his feet firmly on the bridge. He used the technique and then began to walk across. Jae-woon, observing this, remarked that using the absorption technique to such a degree was difficult. His internal energy was indeed quite good. So Jeon, still hesitant, replied that it was nothing. He smiled and said that her standards were too high. Suddenly, a cracking sound emanated from the opening of a trap. A hail of daggers flew at the protagonist, splitting the bridge in two. As he fell, he used the Stairway to Heaven technique and jumped higher to save himself. Jae-woon, in shock, realized it was the Chinggong technique, where he kicks with the top of his foot to leap even higher in the air. He couldn't believe he'd predicted that his opponent would jump up just like that to avoid the trap. However, that still wasn't enough. As MC righted himself and stood on a piece of the bridge, several more daggers instantly flew at him. At the very last moment, he used the Swift Ghost skill, causing all the daggers to pierce not him, but a copy. Then the protagonist made a final dash and entered the building. Looking around, he thought there must be a device to disable the trap. He walked up to the lever, pulled it, and the trap near the bridge closed. He then stepped out onto the edge of the abyss and shouted that he'd disabled the trap and that they could go now. So John, shocked, thought he'd masterfully used a technique that could break legs with the slightest mistake in such an extreme situation. Who was this bastard? After a while, the entire squad entered the cave. Jae-woon called out to him and remarked that his footwork was simply amazing. Had he learned the Swift Ghost technique from Master Gunpyeong? MC thanked him and agreed. So John called out to him and told him not to overpraise him unnecessarily. He smiled and told him to ignore her. She never praised anyone. The girl countered that this was precisely why she was telling him to keep his mouth shut. So John blushed slightly and mused that he'd surprised her a bit, but that still wasn't enough to pass her test. She would prove he was truly worthless. After that, they approached an underground reservoir. The girl noted that it looked like they were there. She gave the command to move forward, and the entire squad began diving into the water, except for Jae-woon. The protagonist asked what he was doing. He replied that he had joined at the last minute and hadn't heard of this lake. This lake is connected to the Valley of Wind and Thunder. If they dive in and swim through the underwater tunnel, they could reach their destination directly, but the entire lake is filled with ice essences. They say that even a single ice essence the size of a fist can freeze an entire well. The moment he enters the lake, he will have to continuously expend all his internal energy for about 15 minutes, protecting his body from the cold. If he didn't do this, he would instantly freeze and sink to the bottom, so he could wait here. At his age, such a technique was nearly impossible. Trying it alone would be tantamount to suicide. The protagonist replied that it was fine. He took a deep breath and thought that he wouldn't have come here at all if he were so afraid of death that he couldn't jump. After these thoughts, the MC dove into the water and was surprised to see so many huge ice crystals here. So that's what he meant by the ice essence. But something was wrong. Since everyone else was suffering, that meant the ice essence was actually having some effect. But despite not using any internal energy, he didn't feel the cold at all. Could it be because he had recently achieved a state of invulnerability to fire and water? Is that why the cold simply couldn't affect him? He hadn't paid much attention to it at the time, but who would have thought it would help now? After some time, the protagonist floated through the tunnel and surfaced with the rest of the squad. Everyone, seeing him, was amazed that everyone else was circulating their chi, while he was so calm, even floating through all this icy essence? How could he even do that? So John wondered if his internal energy was so strong that he didn't even need to circulate. What kind of nonsense was this? So it seemed the deputy pavilion leader had sent him along for a reason. However, the real test was yet to come. She shouted, "Everyone's come to their senses, right?" Get ready to move. The goal is right in front of them. They will show them the power of the Divine Founding Squad. After that, they emerged and, charged with motivation, began to fight the mutated opponents. A bloody battle broke out between the two sides. MC struck with his sword, but the enemy, despite such a wound, did not fall and continued to attack. He wondered if it was a power-stealing demon created with pills and physical enhancement. They seemed completely insensitive to pain. No matter how wounded they were, they continued to advance. How was he supposed to fight one? At that moment, So John called out to him, pointing out that he was in the way. Tell him to go back. With those words, the girl instantly cut two demons into tiny pieces. The protagonist marveled at how amazing it was. She was dispatching power-stealing demons so effortlessly. Yes, he was here to learn from martial artists in real combat. From now on, in the very center of this chaos, he would observe their techniques and make them his own. The protagonist recoiled from the kick and thought that the enemies were still advancing, but if he simply dodged and counterattacked, he could deal with them with the Beast Path and the Shadowless Extreme Speed technique. However, the Innovation Squad was clearly pressuring the cult members, so even if he didn't fight, that wouldn't make much of a difference. He'd be better off using this time to observe and study the techniques of stronger people. With these thoughts, he looked at Jisoo, who pointed her weapon forward, piercing her opponent. At that moment, several more men jumped at her, but she swung her weapon, dealing with them all at once. MC thought this technique allows her to injure multiple opponents with a single attack. How does she do it? Judging by the look of it, this technique is more of a sword technique than a blade technique. It's full of sharp slicing and twisting movements. No, that's not it. He needs to observe her a little longer. At that moment, she took a stance, and the protagonist attacked the attacker. He thought, now I get it. This is one of those techniques that changes depending on the opponent's attacks. Then he remembered Seojun's words, who said that once a sword technique reaches a certain level of mastery, it's not limited by form and movement. At this point, a person is capable of creating a flawless technique with nothing more than good fencing skills and proper body positioning. At that moment, he looked at Jisoo and thought, the squad leader doesn't use any specific technique. She focuses on her enemy's movements and attacks. And each time, she delivers a unique counterattack based on that. Just one attack, and that already covers 9 different sword trajectories. If he were to try applying what he'd just discovered, Jisoo looked at the protagonist, who had rushed into battle and thought that he'd been watching her for some time. What was that boy up to? At that moment, the MC launched a powerful attack and then headed toward the man running toward him. He made a cross-shaped cut, then sighed, thinking that he couldn't create more than 2 trajectories at once right now. At that moment, Jisoo looked at him and thought, how could he just manage to land 2 strikes in one motion just by watching her? But this is one of the pinnacles of her unique blade art. It took her 2 years to master it. At that moment, MC looked at the sword in his hand and thought he couldn't do more now. But the logic was clear. Now he will watch the deputy leader. At that moment, Minjun turned his gaze to him and thought, this guy, it seems like he was just copying the leader, and now he's switched to him? The leader's technique, Supreme Heavenly Blade Moment, is based on the path of the beast, so it's logical to assume that he should be able to copy it to some extent. But his martial art uses dagger throwing and the sword art of the dragon cry. Observations alone certainly wouldn't be enough to replicate this. With these thoughts in mind, he rushed forward, releasing several blades and simultaneously attacking his opponents with his sword. He looked back at the protagonist and thought, how could he do this, Yoonseol? He wouldn't even dare. Then his eyes widened in surprise as the protagonist dual-wielded his weapons and charged, attacking multiple opponents at once. He thought, this is the kind of mindset that allows him to use different martial arts in each hand. Most people would focus on the fact that he was throwing daggers, but he wasn't limited by the weapons he used and saw the very essence of his art. Then the protagonist looked at the bodies lying on the ground and thought, he knew it. He tried to copy the deputy leader's technique, but he wasn't strong enough. He looked at the weapon in his hands and thought, there's no way he could learn this so quickly. If not for the writing from the archives, he wouldn't have been able to perform even this pathetic imitation of a copy. Then he looked to the side and thought, so who's next? He looked at Woojin, who was attacking another opponent, and thought that this wasn't a fire rain sect sword technique. He looked at his sword and thought the power emanating from it was simply incredible. Who would have thought such a simple movement could do such a thing? He didn't think that observing from the outside would help him in this case. Then he walked over to one of the prone bodies and reached out his hand, and Woojin looked at him and thought, this guy, what is he doing there in the middle of the battlefield? And at that moment, MC said in surprise, that's it. At that moment, the man behind him smiled and raised his hand to attack, but the protagonist swung his sword back, piercing the attacker's body. He swung it several times, cutting through his body, and at that moment, he thought, now he understands. As soon as he makes contact with the opponent, he infuses his sword with true chi to maximize his power. MC thought he'd observed the people he needed long enough. At that moment, he heard a shout, Nanya Pavilion, you idiots! How dare they come here? He'll tear everyone to pieces. With those words, seconds, a man leaped toward them, and Minjin, looking at him, said, "Here he is, the leader of the Wind and Thunder Gorge sect." At that moment, he concentrated energy in his hand and shouted loudly, sending 2 magical projectiles forward. The warriors shielded themselves with their hands, trying to fend off his attack, and one of them screamed, "Poison Palm," and Jisoo ran forward and shouted for him to get lost. They leaped at each other, and the man thrust his hand forward, releasing powerful energy, and he shouted for her to die. In response, Jisoo swung her weapon, unleashing a powerful slashing attack. It sliced through her opponent's attack and hit his body. Then she looked down and thought, Unseol, he'd been watching them the entire fight. In such a short time, he'd managed to copy their techniques. Until now, she denied his talent only because she didn't want to acknowledge a child who'd only recently begun studying martial arts. But now she could no longer deny it. At that moment, the attacker concentrated his energy in his hand again, and looking at Jisoo thought, how dare she be distracted while fighting him? He thrust his hand forward again and shouted at her to stop getting cocky. In response, she sighed and asked, doesn't he still see the difference in their skill? The next second, she pointed her weapon at his hand, and he looked at her in confusion. At that moment, his bone broke, and Jisoo unleashed another powerful stream of energy, causing the man to fall lifelessly to the ground. She landed, then looked away and said, the head of the Valley of Wind and Thunder fell by her hand. They must deal with the remaining ones and return to the Wandering Beast Pavilion. After some time, the protagonist climbed the path and reflected that a week had passed since he completed the quest with the Divine Founding Party. Watching martial artists fight in real combat was a learning experience, and in the process, he became curious about how much he himself had changed. He had been so focused on mastering various martial arts as quickly as possible that he himself hadn't really understood the true measure of mastery. He had recently advanced to a higher level in his cultivation technique, so he should prepare thoroughly before the next breakthrough. As he continued climbing the stairs, Minho came out to greet him and remarked that they hadn't seen each other in a while. MC looked at him and said, sir. He then came even closer and said, I've heard of his achievements. He replied that it was all thanks to him. He laughed lightly in response, then looked at him thoughtfully and asked, he's here because he wants to learn more about cultivation, right? The protagonist was surprised. How did he know that? He replied, he hasn't laid the foundations yet. It was time he faced a hurdle because of that. When he was training him, he thought it would take at least 3 years to reach the 3rd level, but it seemed he was wrong. He noticed the energy surging from the protagonist's body, then took his hand, offering to test his internal energy. Then he released his hand and said he had a reserve of internal energy equivalent to over 60 years. The pure true chi he had accumulated since childhood had transformed into antipolar true chi thanks to the activation of his dormant vessels. At that moment, the protagonist thought he knew it all along. What he had felt then was not a mistake. Minho asked. He said he wanted to understand the standards of martial arts, right? The highest level is 1 step above the first rank. There, the body and internal energy reach their maximum limits. And when one transcends this limit and reaches the pinnacle of the martial arts they have mastered, this is the highest peak. Beyond this comes the final, divine limit. Having reached this limit, one will be able to freely control both body and spirit. He will be freed from the shackles of internal energy and the limitations of the human body. The protagonist asked if there was anything higher. He answered, yes. Reaching the pinnacle of martial arts and achieving perfection is what they call the infinite level. Today, the most famous people who have managed to reach this level are considered to be the leader of the Mirim Alliance and the Lord of the Demon Palace, the duo of heavenly emperors, and the emperors of the orthodox and unorthodox paths. MC said, the duo of heavenly emperors of the orthodox and unorthodox paths. He thought, 2 martial artists who rule over the entire sea. Then Minho added, below them are the 3 demons and 3 venerables, then the 4 divine and 7 kings, all of whom have also reached the infinite limit, to which the protagonist replied, I see. Then he thought he really has a lot to learn, and Minho said, and finally, the highest level is called the level of divine intent. With these words, he raised his index finger and then added, the divine intent realm is the level at which he unites with the beings of primordial origin and comprehends the will of the heavens. It is a martial realm that no one has yet reached. He believes that all of this is currently completely unattainable for him. He is currently at the initial stage of the peak realm, having already reached the 3rd realm of the reverse polarity cultivation technique. When he reaches the 4th realm, he will be able to create a true intent that protects the body, and then he will reach the highest peak. Upon reaching the 5th realm, he will be able to shape his internal chi energy, and then, upon reaching the 6th realm, his internal energy will endlessly circulate throughout his body. At the 7th realm, he will be freed from the limitations of his body, and at the final 8th realm, he will attain the power of great nature, the power to interfere with all living things. The protagonist clarified, interfere with all living things? He doesn't quite understand. And Minho said, unfortunately, he himself couldn't really explain it. He'd only managed to reach the late stage of level 5. However, since he was interested in all this, did that mean he'd finally decided to enter the Jianghu arena? MC was surprised. How did he know? But he said so. Otherwise, he wouldn't have asked him all these questions. Then they looked into the distance, and the protagonist said, yes, he's right. He realized that it's in real combat that a person becomes the strongest and fastest. That's why he wants to go to Jianghu. He thought, besides, Wandering Jung-hoo would be wiser than sitting in the demon palace if he wanted to get information about his grandfather's killer. Then Minho turned and said, then he'll need information about Jang-hoo itself. Then he turned and added that he needed to go to Master Cheol. He'd tell him everything he needed. In response, the protagonist bowed and thanked him for his help, and he said that Jang-hoo is a dangerous place. He should be careful. MC said, sir, please. He must take care of himself. After some time, the protagonist came to the forge and watched as Cheol struck a hammer. Then he said, okay. He turned around and asked what brought him here. After a while, he threw the notes on the table, and the protagonist took this one in his hand and asked what this was. He answered what he wanted to know. Then MC began to read and said in surprise, this is the political situation in Jianghu, the characteristics of each sect and clan, as well as information about renowned martial artists. There is even detailed information about the 10 demonic masters. He thought that for an ordinary blacksmith, this knowledge is too detailed. How did he know all this? After that, Cheol turned around and said that if he reads it, he will no longer have any difficulties with the information. When he is finished, he should burn it. He thought he didn't know who he really was, but if he had such information power in his hands, then perhaps he was. Then he said, sir, can I ask him a question? After a while, they sat down at the table, and Cheol said, the ability to freely manipulate bones and muscles, delivering an upward strike that completely cuts off both arms of a moving opponent while using a deadly poison that causes flesh rot and poisonous decomposition, is also a hidden weapon? The protagonist answered, yes, and Cheol thoughtfully said, so a man with such outstanding swordsmanship still uses hidden weapons and even poison, right? It's highly likely that he's a spy who doesn't reveal his identity to Jianghu. The protagonist looked at him in surprise and asked, so he thinks he's not a master of the demonic path? He answered, that's right. He suspects he traded these techniques to hide his true identity, not because he belongs to the demonic path. MC frowned, thinking, so the killer might not be a renowned master of the demonic path? Does that mean he'll have to be wary of orthodox martial artists too? He clenched his fist and thought, but as he said, if all these traces were intentionally planted to mislead others, then how would he find him? Then Cheol said, Unsol, he has a proposition for him. After a while, the protagonist said he wanted to go to Jianghu, and Jiho looked at him and said, he was just wondering what brought him here so suddenly. Wasn't the experience he gained in the Divine Foundation squad enough? He replied that although that experience was very valuable to him, he felt he needed real, live clashes to truly hone his martial arts. Jiho rested his head on his hand and said that he understood, but he couldn't let him go so easily. He was, after all, the deputy pavilion leader. To be allowed to enter Jianghu, he must be a member of a hall or squad and have the leader's approval. MC said he knew, which was why he wanted to join the rescue squad. Jiho looked at him in confusion, then, leaning his hands on the table, stood up and shouted, what? Before he could finish speaking, the protagonist said he heard it from Master Cheol. Not long before, he had told him to join the rescue squad, Inseal. The rescue squad deals with assassinations, kidnappings, and thefts of highly valuable resources. They carry out missions that the Demon Palace doesn't officially recognize. This would be a good opportunity to get what he wants. The protagonist thought that in the current situation, dealing with the killer was truly extremely difficult. If he joined the rescue squad, he would surely be able to find a clue. They are given dangerous missions where you risk your life every time, which means he will definitely become stronger there. Then Jiho shouted, no, he can't allow this. Before he could finish speaking, the protagonist said he knew what they were doing. The moment he joined them, his identity would be erased, and he would have to risk his life on every mission. Then, Jiho turned around and said, exactly. They take on all the dirtiest work for the demonic palace. To join them, he would have to erase both his identity and his own name. He wouldn't be able to count on anyone's help. Only those trying to atone for their crimes, or those who urgently need huge sums of money, go there. Was he seriously intending to do this? He replied that he wanted to become stronger as quickly as possible. If the path to strength lay through the rescue squad, then he would do everything necessary. The 10 demonic masters were merely a tool to eliminate orthodox martial artists. The stronger, the better. And Jiho said, as he had said, most of the 10 demonic sects use their demonic masters for their own ends, but they are different. He turned around and shouted that he wanted to make him a full member of the pavilion. He extended his hand forward. The protagonist looked at him in surprise. He then bowed and said that he understood what he was getting at, but that was precisely why he should join the rescue squad. Jiho asked why. He replied that, judging by what he'd seen, people from the Pavilion of the Wandering Knight don't grow stronger in comfort and protection. Jiho then placed his hand on the table and, sighing, said that he saw that he wouldn't change his mind. Fine, but only for 1 year. In response, the MC thanked him, and he added that if at any point he was satisfied with his progress, he should leave the rescue squad and return to them. The protagonist bowed and said that he understood. Jiho looked at him and said that since he was going to Jianghu, he should allow him to give him some useful advice. His appearance was too conspicuous right now. Besides, he was the most famous of the 10 demonic masters. Hiding his identity would be of great benefit to him. After a while, Dongting Lake, MC stepped forward and adjusted his hat. Looking around, he thought, before, when he came here under his real name, people would do nothing but whisper behind his back. It was a good thing the deputy chief taught him how to disguise himself. This place was the Yueyang branch of the rescue squad.